Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm Will.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Kate.
We are following the reading schedule from the Pynchon subreddit, and today we are discussing chapters 46 through 50 of Mason and Dixon. Will can summarize those chapters for us.
Yeah, as they move west into the vicinity of a highway so thoroughly trafficked by traders that Dixon finds his compass thwarted by the vast quantities of iron, we see a few of the daily habits of the crew. Firstly, the nightly drink of the workers, hangovers leaving them so out of commission that Mason wonders at French sabotage. Next, the daily audience, the captain of the camp, Overseer Barnes, grants to petitions and interpersonal disputes. From petty annoyances, repeated jokes, to dietary restrictions, the porridge oats being too coarse, even to small acts of extortion, a certain lady having the habit of concealing the cost of her company until after they've made it to the bed. Barnes will sort out the issues. Except for that last one, those duties of pimpery have been placed in the hands of a young man named Nate McLean. While the boy would rather be treated as a greenhorn and have some alone time to read what books he can acquire on the trail, everyone has decided that he isn't one to mess with, and so his attempts at de-escalation simply result in bribes being thrown his way. In a letter to his schoolmate, Nate looks for sympathy, finding greed so insidious even to defy his direct refutations, the brown-nosing intolerable, and the romantic advances unmanageable. The next scenes are made up of the details of error management in such a grand task of surveillance, the title duo trading off whose preferred methods guide them from time to time until they reach the Susquehanna. There, Dixon sets off with his chainmen and Nate McLean's father to measure the width of the river, which turns out to be more tortuous than expected, while Mason attempts to line up where the arc shall depart the river's shore and where it shall arrive on the other side. Just as they complete the necessary measurements to work these problems out, a thunderstorm swells. In the thrall of electromania, Dixon wonders at the strangely wide and contiguous bolts, while Mason seeks shelter under an iron-laden wagon. Back in the letters of young Mr. McLean, we see a cream-pot romance strike up between he and a milkmaid, a class who seem to populate the dreams of all the restless folk around, even as we are told that they're counterfeiting the milk. Fearing for the virtue of his Galactica in the wilderness, Nate plans to abandon her as they continue west, promising to bring her with him when he returns to school later that year. The crew has turned back around, heading east to measure offsets, and Mason and Dixon's intimacy has graduated into the realm of the truly personal subjects, coffee versus tea, for example. When they make it back to the geometric and cartographic horror show that is Delaware, they find themselves out late at night, Dixon with a lantern in one hand and a plumb line in the other, as Mason attempts to line him up with certain stars communicating from a ways, with a large horn to amplify his commands of left and right. When they finalize these lines, they've created a sort of no-man's wedge of property, not properly claimed by any of the colonies surrounding. The legally murky territory comes to become a strange place of attraction to the secretive, conveniently circumscribing a magnetic hill rumored to house elves. They leave the mess to be sorted out by the proprietors of the bordering Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware, and return to the Susquehanna. On the way, Dixon's dynamic chainman duo of Darby and Cope stumble into regularly impersonating Mason and Dixon, each playing whoever they feel like at the moment as they frequent taverns and incidentally send young ladies in search of Mason and Dixon, only to be disappointed by the true bearers of the names. Dixon quickly susses out the culprits and initially takes pity on them, knowing how tedious the job of line running can be for those sanctioned only to measure, never calculate, and they consider momentarily entrusting the problem children with some responsibility. However, when they find their troublesome doppelgangers, the sympathy evaporates on learning that Darby and Cope have been utterly demolishing any hope of precision in their entire project by trialing unorthodox methods of counting and frequently forgetting such intentions, lapsing back into normal methods midway through a length. Befuddled by the innocence with which this devastating news is delivered, it only takes a hint at their other suspicions for the case of stolen identities to be sewn up, and they descend into mutual beatings as they blame one another. The party arrives at the river, ready to embark further westward and receive a package from Maskelyne, a publication of updated methods of error cancellation in their work. Dixon is peeved by the removal of another source of trustworthy geometry, as Maskelyne's harebrained theories about mountainous gravity have turned out more reasonable than they'd all hoped. Mason shudders to remember those measurements on the windward side of St. Helena. Across the Susquehanna, they're so impressed by the Edenic beauty all around that they can't but wonder at having trespassed into some dream world. Summer brings lightning bugs, and Dixon uses some of that weird Geordie magic to funnel some of them into portable flameless lamps to light their tents. On, they draw the line into wilderness, and Dixon develops an overlate case of cold feet. He feels they're being used for some greater purpose, something even more devious than American politics. Mason, of course, centers himself, wondering if Maskelyne is French, in league with the invisible Jesuit forces, somehow hiding messages in the notes on observations, while Dixon mainly critiques the theory on the grounds of insufficient commercial incentive. The party approaches the Redsinger farm, and both Armand and Louisa are heartbroken by the end of their affair brought by Peter's return. Furthermore, while he's physically returned, his mind seems to only have space for the memories of his adventures with Christ, and he talks Louisa's ear off with them, and refuses to hear any news from her. Depew brings up an idea he'd heard at a sermon once, that all points on heaven and earth can be mapped in relation to each other, and to hell as well. This brings him back to the subject of infinitesimality, supposing hell to be even more physically restrictive than the others. This would of course imply a limitation on the size of heaven, an implication which Tenebrae can only find fault in. As they continue into uncharted lands, Mason and Dixon decide to get to know the region better and create a regular plan for when they come upon crossroads. They split up, heading opposite ways in search of a tavern, either turning back to meet the other if they passed a certain distance without finding one, or continuing on into it. In this way, they find a lot of entertainment along the road. One such day of idle pleasure, Dixon finds the Rabbi of Prague, where a secretive Kabbalistic sect is headquartered. It turns out, according to those in attendance, the surrounding area is inhabited by a giant invisible golem, one that protects the residents, which was created by one of the lost tribes of Israel, one of the native tribes, centuries ago. They discuss theories of metaphysics and history. The leaders there even see mystic meaning in the boundary line being drawn. It turns out one of those number is Timothy Talks, the great poet himself, hiding out from the British soldiers. As he recites the offending piece of literature, the golem stirs, apparently roused by the discussion of tyranny, and they toast it.
All right, thank you for that. So let's just start with everyone's overall feelings on these chapters.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking a bit before we actually started recording that there's not, from a standpoint of like, I don't want to say substance because there is still substance here, but from a standpoint of things happening, there's not a ton. Like, there's a lot of kind of slice of life stuff here that's both entertaining and at times funny, of just sort of life working on the surveying line. Like, you get a good sense in those first couple chapters of just, you know, a broader idea of how many people are there. You know, it's pretty easy prior to the past section of chapters in this one to assume that it might be just Mason and Dixon and like maybe 3 or 4 other guys, but this is like an actual sort of continuously moving kind of base of operations with a lot of people working it, and Pynchon gives you a better idea of that through sort of giving you this sort of schedule of how the day is going to go, what they do every day, the kind of common gripes that certain members of their party have, which is certainly an entertaining part, and the fact that there are sort of these, like, you know, for lack of a better term, like comical union boss-esque characters from, you know, like a gangster movie or something that go and they solicit deals and they take care of stuff for the line party out in the local towns and in the local farms and houses and everything. That's sort of what Nath has taken on as being his role. And beyond that, we get some more interesting stuff about, you know, Mason and Dixon talking about their destiny or their future, what they were meant for, the looming shadow of the seahorse incident, and then we have the whole section of the golem towards the end, which I'm very excited to hear Luke talk about, because he was proved correct in a direct comparison between the duck and an actual golem appearing. But outside of that, it's a lot of just sort of, this is what it's like to work on a surveying line, and you're going to get a better sense of what that's like through these chapters.
Yeah, I agree that these chapters are kind of more hangout chapters, a little bit lower stakes. I did like. I think these chapters. I listened to these on an audiobook. So I'm actually now looking over the chapters and realizing that I didn't have as good of a grasp as I thought I did. But anyway, the stuff about Stig I really liked. Stig the Axeman. Even the first time I read this book, which was probably, I think, about 9 years ago. I would have started it around this time, about 9 years ago. Stig really stood out to me in terms of different characters. I mean, you obviously focus on Mason and Dixon a lot. And I have noticed in me kind of glancing through some scholarship that there are some characters like that who will kind of stand out for different people. Like one of the scholars I was reading, he focused a lot on Zhang, who we are yet to meet, but I believe it's prophesied in these chapters that we are going to meet a Chinaman, which I guess is an epithet, but a person from China. But yeah, the stuff about Stig and the prostitute, I enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was pretty funny. Just to kind of, he takes the axe to bed with him. He yells "Yingle Yangle," which the Yingle Yangle stuff, especially, I thought was pretty comedic. There is a lot about drinking in these chapters, which I enjoyed. I mean, it is something that I've kind of thought about in general whenever teaching older literature in the past, is the role of alcohol in human civilization, the role of alcohol in being an adult, even the role of alcohol and stuff like, like how like it would have been hard to find clean water and clean stuff to drink unless it was sanitized by alcohol for thousands of years. Cholera was such a big deal for so long in human civilization, and I do think that people drank. I think it was more. I've heard more about the 1800s and the widespread nature of alcoholism, which I think did kind of lead to the prohibition movement in America. But I don't think that the late 1700s are probably drastically different in terms of alcohol consumption. Yeah, I found all that entertaining. It is kind of entertaining that Mason and Dixon in chapter 50 like figured out this whole system of searching out taverns and places to drink. And yeah, I mean, these chapters were enjoyable. There's some comedy in there. The stuff's not as laugh out loud funny as some previous chapters, but overall, I mean, it's yeah, like I said, these are kind of just hangout chapters that are kind of breezy to get through. Which I enjoyed.
Yeah, I kind of like, at the risk of kind of sounding reductive, I felt like they had kind of a lazy Sunday vibe, like not in a bad way, just in a very like Kate mentioned, like, or I think it was maybe Luke that said low stakes. But yeah, I mean, there's things happen, and we're moving forward, and we're getting a lot of glimpses into these workers' lives and everything. But it didn't have there's not really any urgency that any of the characters are dealing with. There's no major conflicts taking place. But it was an enjoyable 5 chapters. Like, I really had a good time reading them. I don't think there were any parts that I really struggled to understand and had to like go back to a couple of times, like with previous chapters. So it was nice. It was kind of a nice break from the previous few batches of chapters that we've done, where there's been just so much going on and so much crammed into so little space. It's nice to have these, it's nice to have these kind of chapters, or these sets of chapters that kind of let things slow down, but in a way that it doesn't feel like the story's being ground down to a halt. It's still moving forward. We're just kind of, pushing the pedal on the brakes a little bit to slow it down.
Which feels very intentional in a way that I don't know if I could say is necessarily present in a lot of Pynchon's other work. Like, obviously I haven't read Against the Day, but his sort of third big book being Gravity's Rainbow, there is no like respite in that novel. It's just continuous sort of assault on your senses and your processing ability. Whereas, with every single time we've had a section of chapters, like with this past section where we all kind of agree, yeah, they're kind of hangout chapters, to use Luke's phrase, or they're a bit more lower stakes. It always comes after some incredibly heavy stuff that may have happened over the course of just 5 chapters, maybe 10 chapters. And so it's it really speaks to just how deliberately I think Pynchon has set down and plotted out this novel in particular, where he knows just all of the stuff that he's going to get into. He knows how he's going to get into it, but he also understands that he can't sustain that over 700 pages necessarily. And so he puts these things in there, which I think shows his maturity as a writer versus something like Gravity's Rainbow, where I feel like if he had potentially written Gravity's Rainbow, in the mid to late 90s, there maybe would have been a bit more moments of respite in that novel.
Yeah, and I think I like that you mentioned it felt deliberate, because I think that the kind of opening section of chapter 46 has that deliberate feel to it. Like we're getting a feel of what these what the workers are doing on their downtime, kind of sensing their fatigue and everything. It's absolutely it has an intentional feel, and he does do that in Against the Day. There are moments in there where the pace of everything kind of slows down a little bit, and you kind of get to catch your breath and process all the things that have happened while still moving forward in the story. And I think that's really definitely a sign of his maturity as a writer, in the 20, 30 years between Gravity's Rainbow and these books.
Yeah, absolutely.
It strikes me as quite ironic that while this is definitely the plot slowing down, when you hear Mason and Dixon, when you think of the Mason-Dixon line, what they're doing in these 5 chapters is the most work they're going to do in any any section this short. This is the most work. This is the most plotting they are going to be doing.
The most plotting and the least plot.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's some interesting parts of these chapters as well. I mean, I do think it's interesting that Mason and Dixon don't come to, like, the whole Darby and Cope impersonating Mason and Dixon isn't really portrayed as being a massive deal. I've had this kind of leads into the other thing I wanted to talk about. Whenever I was in college, I had a very good friend who we were known for going out to parties and bars together, and people would ask, where he was when I wasn't around. So we kind of had this whole pairing thing. And it would have definitely bothered me a lot if somebody was trying to impersonate him and I. It doesn't. Mason and Dixon don't seem overly. I mean, they seem bothered about it, but it doesn't. It's not like a major deal. You would think that perhaps that'd be like grounds for firing Darby and Cope. There's just not a lot of. There's not a lot of conflict there, and I do think that. I don't know if that's sense. I don't know if I would describe it as a missed opportunity or just kind of more of a example of Pynchon kind of having different focuses than a lot of authors. But I do think that would be handled differently than by a different author. That possible conflict. And I enjoyed the whole the Nath letter at the end of chapter 46. Mm-hmm. He does seem to really go off on how misunderstood he is by the party, and different issues with him being him having kind of issues that a lot of young people have in terms of being misunderstood and having kind of unfulfilled dreams. I think that there's a few different possible reasons for this, but something that does stick out to me from my college years is how misunderstood I felt a lot of the time. And I do think that that's an important kind of aspect of that character, and that letter that he sends is how he doesn't seem to feel like he's fitting in that well, or he's fitting in too well in a bad way. And people seem to view him in a way that he doesn't view himself. Which I do think is interesting and is kind of a powerful capturing of how it feels to be around that age.
Yeah, well, and to circle back on your mention of Darby and Cope and the way that they were dealt with by Mason and Dixon, I have to kind of wonder if maybe the reason that they kind of brushed off everything that happened with them is the difficulty in replacing them. Even though they're only 2 people, like you're that far into this major project, they probably wouldn't have had a lot of access to skilled workers that could do this kind of work, and replacing them mid-job and wherever they were at the time just may have been more difficult than was ever really mentioned in there. So that may be part of why they kind of just let it happen and didn't make too big of a deal out of it. I don't know. That's just kind of my speculation.
As somebody who manages a coffee place, there are a lot of just sort of jokes. Like, I have a very distinctive laugh, and a lot of my baristas imitate it anytime they hear it. And like, it doesn't bother me, but it also isn't worth it for me to be like, can you stop? It's probably just the same. It's probably just the same thing with Darby and Cope, if I'd assume. It's just Mason and Dixon being like, whatever, this is more, it would be more of a hassle for us to get involved with this than it's worth, than just leaving it alone. But there is part of me too that wonders if it isn't like, and there's no way to actually confirm this, but in actually reading through Mason's journal, as I did over the past week, they are never mentioned separately from one another. Every single time one of them is mentioned, it is always Misters Darby and Cope. There's never just Darby. There's never just Cope. So I could also see Thomas Pynchon reading through that journal, as I'm sure he did, and then going, oh, well, they're kind of like the only other people that are mentioned in tandem all the time. What if they impersonated the other people mentioned in tandem all the time? There's no way to confirm it, but that's also swimming around in my mind as a reason why it was included.
No, that's a good point. Yeah. I need to dive into that because I'm really interested to read through that. So I'm glad you did. And you can bring that kind of stuff in.
Yeah. I kind of got the sense that really they saw. I mean, that they didn't even confront them yet, and immediately Darby and Cope are spilling their guts about how they're truly mishandling their job.
Yeah,
like they are not good at their job.
It's pretty bad.
Like, seriously, think about what running a chain is. It's basically running out using a chain as a length and then standing still so the other person can run forward, and you just trade back and forth. And what they are doing is randomly varying the length of a chain by one, plus or minus one, at points they have no clue about. That is the exact opposite of their job. Frankly, I would have fired them based on that alone. So it has to be that there's nobody there who can stand still and hold a chain, apparently. Because these guys not only are running around stealing the identities of their employers, although granted, the worst that seems to come to is, some tavern bills and some some young ladies thinking that
more mischievous than anything.
Yeah. But really, I mean, really, they devolve into fist fighting over literally the phrase all content otherwise. These guys are completely worthless as far as I'm concerned.
It reminded me of Beavis and Butthead. That's Darby and Cope for me. Is specifically, and because you mentioned the chain running, and I'll keep this short because it's completely irrelevant, but there was a Beavis and Butthead episode where they were supposed to be selling chocolates for their school, and what they ended up doing was buying them from each other with the same dollar bill until they just ran out of chocolate and still had $1. That's essentially what this was to me.
Yeah, that I feel like that is a completely fair characterization of the two of them. They are just basically buffoons. Yeah,
and I love those interactions with them though, because they were absolutely hilarious.
Yeah, they do seem to be examples of the whole ne'er-do-well. I can't remember in what book. Probably, I think schlemiel comes up in his other books. The word schlemiel.
Oh yeah, definitely in V.
Yeah. They do seem to be kind of examples of that, where they're perhaps lovable, but they don't seem to be able to do anything right.
Yeah, just goofballs. Yeah.
Well, and I don't know if you noticed, Luke, but on at least the audiobook I'm listening to, the narrator for either Darby or Cope, I'm not sure who's speaking at any given moment, but one of them is basically an imitation of a slightly lesser version of the Gloucester accent that he puts on for Mason. And I think that's a nice little touch.
Yeah, I have trouble discerning which that narrator's different accents, and it all just vaguely sounds British to me.
Those accents can be hard to parse out, though, to be fair.
Yeah.
So yeah, chapter 46. So I had no idea. The Pynchon wiki mentioned that egg slap is a mnemonic device. I had never heard of this before, even growing up Catholic. that it's the 7 deadly sins. So that was really an interesting thing to learn and add to that character.
Yeah, it definitely does kind of, 'cause, egg slap just kind of sounds like the kind of typical Pynchon, like throwing together 2 words, and it's vaguely comedic whenever you think about it, having to call someone that name. Yeah. But it also kind of shows that another aspect of the Pynchon naming, how Pynchon names characters is, it scans as kind of random and vaguely funny, and then once you examine it more, it actually has some depth, and it adds to the themes of the book, which I do think is interesting, and does seem to happen a fair amount with Pynchon, especially when it comes to like anagrams and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's something I never really picked up on the first couple of times I read his work, and then once I started, especially once I started utilizing the wiki, that kind of opened that up. And so yeah, it always, anytime that I come across a name that just seems almost too random, I have to look into it and just see if there's anything more to it.
Well, it generally leads to discoveries like that, so I'd say that's a pretty good way to go about reading them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if any of y'all thought that the Nate McLean was obviously he is clean souled, he's innocent, but he's also making a lot of money. Just kind of getting a McDonald's vibe.
I didn't think about that.
Fair.
What did y'all make of the? I really enjoyed the whole argument over, as I put it in my notes, book reading on page 457. I think that's, if I recall correctly, that's the second time we've really had like an explicit mention of books within the book and their kind of impact on people. This one particularly was another one of those kind of like, what's the value in reading conversations or debates between the characters, that I'm sure was absolutely fun for him to write and kind of take on both of those sides of that argument.
It is interesting that the perhaps controversial nature of being somebody who's maybe more into books than other aspects of life is, like I said, controversial. It's an attitude that I've come across a little bit in the service industry. So as I talked about in one of our earlier episodes, I think that was about Crying Block 49, is I've done pizza delivery kind of on and off throughout my life, and some of the pizza delivery jobs, I've been able to sit around and read books, and that's definitely has colored other people's views of me. And it's kind of, I do think, I noticed at this job that I'm at right now, it has kind of, whenever I first started, before people got to know me, I think it kind of came off the wrong way to some people that I was sitting around reading books while on the clock. But yeah, I mean, I don't, I think another interesting aspect of that is I assume that a lot of the people on the expedition are in some way educated and probably literate. But I mean, being literate, I think some people, I'm sure our listeners who have read Pynchon are well aware of the historical nature of the historical like fact of literacy having only recently been an almost universal aspect of human life. But yeah, it is interesting that it's kind of viewed as, I mean, it's portrayed as a little bit controversial to be very into books in this book.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's I kind of want to say it's a long held kind of viewpoint. Similar to you, Luke, I've had situations where I work when I've been doing the job I've been doing, or working for the company I've been working for 10 years now. And since day one, like when I was in training, I had a book with me every day in training, and I would, anytime we had downtime, I was just in my book, and I would always get comments from people of, like, why are you reading? Why not talk to other people? I don't like talking to other people. I like reading books. That's why I bring a book. Like, I'm not here for office drama and all that. Like, I want to just read a story, and books. As someone who has been a reader my whole life, parts of these kind of things in this book always kind of resonate with me, because I think there's that negative viewpoint of people who read as being like, oh, they're wasting time. You could be making money or doing all these side hustles and all this other stuff and blah blah blah. But reading is just always seen as a waste of time, which I think is absolutely untrue. I think it's vital that people read. And my wife is a librarian, so like I'm always trying to get people to read. And when people ask me, like, what do you like to read? Or I was at the dentist the other day and she asked why, what I spent my summer vacation doing. And I read a lot. And she's, oh, I don't remember the last time I read a book. And I was like, well, go find a book, find something that interests you and read. Like that's, I don't like that. That's the kind of cultural mindset that we have. Not we, but so many people have of exactly that. Like he's wasting too much damn time reading books, is exactly as it's mentioned in here. And yeah, it's those kind of scenes really resonate with me.
Well, and that's been my experience as well over the course of my life between, working in the service industry. Obviously, it was kind of expected when I was working as a minister that I did a lot of reading, and I did. So that was maybe the only period of my life which comprised about 3 years where reading all of the time was not seen as strange. It was seen as the norm, especially as I was going through seminary. But like in every job that I've had outside of that, whether it be service industry jobs in restaurants or in cafes or just retail, it is genuinely seen as strange, for lack of a better term, or people don't really know how to react to it, which I find weird. It's almost like they're being confronted with something they weren't expecting to see that day, a person reading a book. And it does always prompt interesting conversations similar to the ones that the two of you have recounted. But it is interesting that appears to always be a thing. In the 90s, there were not smartphones yet. Like a lot of these things that we would easily point to as being reasons why people don't read much anymore weren't around in the 90s and in the decades prior to 97 when this book was published. Obviously, Pynchon was working on it for a while, but it's strange to me that this idea that you can read too much, or that it's strange that you would always be reading, has perpetuated throughout society's history longer than there seems to be any rational explanation for. And seeing it included here is very interesting. And very thought-provoking in a number of ways, not just from your own experience, but from wondering why it is that somebody would care back in the 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'd like to draw a bit of a distinction here, because we've seen two instances of conversations about the worth of books. But what we've actually seen is one conversation about the worth of novels and one conversation about the worth of books. And in the conversation about the worth of novels, the person who's standing against it is he's not quite a titan, but he's a giant of industry. He is literate. He almost certainly has read books. He's just not reading storybooks. And here we have, Nate going to school. He's probably mostly not reading novels. He's probably mostly reading at this point in time with like a classical education at the William and Mary's College. He's probably reading philosophy. He's probably reading mathematics or science books. He's probably not doing a lot of just sitting back and reading, a John Grisham type work.
Not reading the ghastly fop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He doesn't like reading the ghastly fop. It's not what he wants.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the, we do have in our culture, North American Anglo culture, we do have this sort of anti-intellectualism, which generally stands against reading, which I think is what Archibald MacLean is kind of representing here. But we also have something that so compared to the rest of you, I am much more of an extrovert. As a result, I don't tend to take a book for break at work or to social things. And just to be clear, not judging any of you for it. I've done it before. I'd happily do it again. It's just not what I typically do. However, that means that I've had many conversations with people who do genuinely only read nonfiction books in kind of the same way that Wade LeSparc might have. And there is a big distinction between people who are anti-reading in general and people who are anti-fiction reading. Although, frankly, I find a lot more sympathy in the anti-reading people than with the people who just take themselves too seriously to have a good time every once in a while.
That's a great point. Yeah.
That's excellently said.
So, let's kind of shift over and talk about Nathaniel's letter. I apologize for not remembering who it was that brought it up when we were kind of talking about the overall chapter itself, but I really enjoyed his letter. I thought it brought up some interesting topics and really presented an interesting picture of what happens to a person when you give them power and money. So how did y'all feel about, or what did you come away with from that?
No, I agree completely. That was actually going to be my quote for the end of the podcast, but I think that Nathaniel's letter represents like a lot of things. We talk often about like how Thomas Pynchon characterizes kind of youthful innocence at various stages of life. Obviously, there's the section of Crying of Lot 49 where there's the children, like genuine children who are playing around the muted post horn. You know, their inability to understand the further context of what they're playing around. They just see a way to make a game out of it. And we've mentioned at a couple of different points in this novel where Pynchon has kind of gone into this idea of you know, this is a death of innocence point, or this is where, you know, you learn something about the world and become more of an adult or less of a younger individual. I think the same thing is true with this letter that Nath writes out. It kind of represents a person genuinely seeing what the wider adult world is like and what some of the implications of that are for the first time. And in particular, the idea of having power and having the ability to amass, you know, wealth through greed is something that he is particularly being exposed to, I should say. And it does read to me like someone who genuinely doesn't understand why this is a thing and doesn't understand why it is that this is how something goes, but it's communicated in such an intelligent way because it's coming from this person who, as Will just pointed out, is receiving a very traditional upscale education and can, you know, put these thoughts together in a bit more of a coherent wording. So it was really kind of, I don't want to say a shock to the system necessarily, but a little bit of that, where you do get a genuine outside perspective of what it would be like to suddenly be thrust into a position with power and the ability to gain influence and wealth out of it, and whether or not that's something that would inherently appeal to somebody who has no bearing to understand those things prior to now. It's a really interesting piece of writing that I honestly could have read several pages more of that letter and just listened to him kind of describe his experience on the line and how it's changed his life up to that point. But of course, Pynchon has other things to move on to, so we didn't get more time, even though I would have loved that.
I actually find it interesting. I don't find Nate at this point in time, and I think later in the book he begins to be, you know, corrupted, if you want to use that term, more indulgent in greed. But what I view this whole chapter kind of as is a comedy of errors where Nate, or well, I suppose a comedy of manners, where Nate is just trying to convince people, hey, just leave me alone. Hey, what are you talking about? That's extreme. Like, oh, 5%. I don't want your 5%. And immediately, Mrs. Eggslap just says, oh, well, of course, you'll get a little bit more than that. And I view the whole letter I'm less sympathetic to it in the way that Luke was in with regard to, you know, the discomfort of being young and finding yourself sort of lost in these things. But what I found very resonant with in my life is the experience of being a young man, especially a young white man, because as has become quite commonly spoken about, you know, men are often referred or deferred to a lot more than women are. And there is this bizarre feeling where you're suddenly taken as a man by random people on the street, and you just say something, and it's taken seriously. Suddenly, you wake up one day, and what you say is taken seriously, as though you have any real input that matters to be given.
Mm-hmm.
And Nate here is just kind of experiencing the maximum version of that.
Yeah, it kind of it in a weird way reminded me of the hipster werewolf, in that it kind of almost is like a parallel to going through puberty. Like he's, you know, this really young man suddenly has this huge change that's put upon him, and he doesn't really know how to deal with all the new parts of him, in a sense. You know, he's got this new power, this new sort of quote unquote respect. And a lot of this letter just reads like him trying to figure out what the hell's going on and what he does going forward.
Yeah, I agree completely. Also, when you said weirdly it reminds me of, I thought you were going to build off of what Will said and say it reminds you of the Barbie movie, because there is a scene in the Barbie movie that is very similar to what Will has just elucidated about realizing that you're a man.
Look, we could talk about the Barbie movie for a few hours if you want to, because it was awesome. So,
I still need to see it. I want to see it pretty bad.
Holy crap, it's so good.
Yeah, I'm waiting until it's out of theaters, just because I kind of want to flip the bird to Mattel, but I look forward to it.
It's very, very good.
It's not what you're expecting it is, that's for sure.
From the opening, literally the opening scene, I was like, okay, I'm 100% in now.
Yeah, it's Greta Gerwig. It's going to be interesting, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to go back to the letter, whenever I was listening to the audiobook, the line, "I'm not the sinister pimp they take me for,"
yeah,
it always kind of made me snap to attention a little bit. It's a really interesting sentence, one that probably it does seem to fit into the chapter, into the letter pretty well, but it perhaps, you know, it's this type of sentence that if you were to isolate it and ask someone, you know, what kind of book would you think this was from, it'd be more like a detective novel or something. You know, it's not something, you don't associate the phrase sinister pimp with the 1800s or Mason and Dixon or anything. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I did also find that we could ride our winged pigs side by side through the ether and chat about it all. I don't think that Mason and Dixon or Lot 49 have had a lot about pigs. I know that it's definitely a thing that Pynchon fans and Pynchon scholars will share with one another, is Pynchon's obsession with pigs. I think he's reputed to own like small statues of pigs or things like that, which I'm not 100% where that comes from. But I do think that that's a thing for him, and I do think that pigs do kind of dip in and out of his work a little bit more often than other types of animals. I don't know. I mean, the line, "Oh, for someone understanding out here in this endless forest," that is a type of overly dramatic thing that I would have definitely journaled in my undergrad years, maybe without the O, and then I'd probably change the word forest, but it is definitely the type of angst that I would have communicated to my journal, or I guess I wasn't really writing letters, but maybe in a text or an email, I might have written something like that.
18th century live journal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that little section I found especially interesting, and I do think it's interesting that we get a letter from him at all, that he kind of takes over as the POV character. Because he's not a super major character. I think, you know, I feel like even probably Darby and Cope are given a little bit more screen time overall.
It's interesting that he did it as a letter too, rather than just having it as just shifting POVs in the story itself and keeping the same kind of narrative structure. Doing the letter was an interesting choice, I thought.
Yeah. Well, and I think to bring up again Will's point about where Nath ends up being later on, like what he actually ends up becoming, I think that the purpose of inserting the letter and getting this feeling or this internal struggle he's having, or this internal realization he's having of his position in life and what he's capable of with the power vested in him, whether he wanted it or not, is one of these illustrations that Pynchon is potentially trying to make of, what happens when you're given power, what happens when you're given influence, what happens when you're given control, what happens when you're given the ability to just amass wealth, which he doesn't need or necessarily want, as is recounted in that 5% conversation. Do you end up losing your innocence and becoming the person that he becomes later, or is it possible to resist that? I think that he's once again, playing a clever game of trying to illustrate to the reader what can happen to somebody when they're thrust into that position, and how it is that cruelty or greed can spring from places where it wasn't initially even wanted.
I really appreciate the sinister pimp line as well, Luke. And it's actually, I think it's the second time that flying pigs has been mentioned in Mason and Dixon. The first time, to my memory, correct me if I'm wrong, listeners, was the opening of chapter 26, the America section, where it says, "For skies grow thick with aviating swine, ere men pass up the chance to draw a line."
Yeah, it does seem to be a riff on the whole when pigs fly thing.
Yeah,
definitely.
The inclusion of pimp also made me do some research, and I learned that is a much older word than I thought.
Really?
Yeah, the first doc, because I thought that it might be a case of Pynchon specifically using anachronism, but
yeah,
the first appearance of the word pimp was 1607.
Holy shit! Really?
Yeah, in a Thomas Middleton play entitled "Your Five Gallants." Nobody knows exactly how the word was like synthesized and why Thomas Middleton used it. Like the actual origin is unaware, but the guess is that it stems from a French infinitive pimper, which meant to dress up elegantly, and from the present participle pimpant, meaning alluring in seductive dress. So yeah, I had no idea that was where we got that from. I thought that was a much, much more modern term than it actually is.
Interesting. Well, there's our etymology lesson for the week.
Yeah, I actually had like a weird faux etymology in my head where pimp actually started as a fixer, kind of like Nate McLean is being in general here.
Right.
I did not realize that it really does just come from what its modern meaning is.
Basically, yeah.
Like it looks like there's some arguments in etymological journals and stuff, but interesting, yeah.
Well, let's move on to chapter 47. I didn't really have much to talk about in here, other than I really liked the whole scene with Mason trying to get away from the lightning. I just thought that was really funny, like his attempts to just essentially hide from it under various things. Just greatly amused me. But other than that, like, if any of y'all have anything you want to bring up, please do. I didn't really have anything else for this chapter.
No, I think it is mostly about kind of getting into the mindset of drawing the line. I don't get much more out of it than kind of a slice of life, and then that comic scene.
There is a mention of lightning from Mason's journal that I could read instead of at the end of the episode if we want to do that, which I believe is probably where Pynchon got this anecdote from. So let me bring this up. This comes from page 87 in his journal. It says, May the 25th, in the evening, a storm of thunder and lightning. About sunset, I was returning from the other side of the river, and at a distance of about 1.5 miles, the lightning fell in perpendicular streaks, about a foot in breadth to appearance, from the cloud to the ground. This was the first lightning I ever saw in streaks, continued with the least break through the hole, all the way from cloud to horizon. So it seems as though this is something, I would imagine that Thomas Pynchon read that section of his journal and then just spun this whole
some of that's
scene
word for word in here.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, and the date lines up too, because chapter 48 starts on the 29th of May. So that, yeah, I mean, time frame.
Yeah.
That's just like a testament to the insane level of detail that went into putting this together.
This is exactly why I was enjoying reading his journal so much this past week.
I know what I'm doing this weekend now.
I do love the way that Dixon is just kind of hypnotized by the beauty of these lightning strikes. And, you know, he's right. Being underneath a wagon covered in metal fittings is definitely more dangerous than being in a canvas tent.
Yeah.
But it's pretty hilarious to imagine him just calmly packing a pipe bowl.
Watching Mason struggle, like just
Watching
struggle to find
freak
somewhere
out.
to feel safe.
It is definitely just another one of those friendship moments where he's like, I'm just gonna watch him struggle silently.
Just the dichotomy between these two is so fun.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, let's talk about the most important thing here: coffee or tea.
This is one of the funniest things that we've read so far, I think, in these.
I really enjoyed this whole debate.
Yep.
Definitely like the description of the coffee kind of going bad and different stuff like that, and Dixon being able to drink like the worst of it, and then I think Mason is only able to get down like the first cup or something. It did remind me, I think I've mentioned this at least in our group chat, that I took a class on Cormac McCarthy in college or in grad school. And it's either in the book No Country for Old Men or the movie that there's a character who I think the Tommy Lee Jones character drinks a cup of coffee when he visits somebody's house, and he like kind of grimaces and he asks when the coffee was made, and I guess the guy like had made the coffee like 4 or 5 days before and just kept on reheating it. Which it just kind of reminded me of that, which I don't, like I've never made coffee really at all, especially not like on a stove, and especially not, I've never reheated it after a few days or anything, but it did just kind of remind me of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that coffee seems to. I'm on Dixon's side on this, by the way. I'm very much more a coffee drinker than tea. I have tried to enjoy tea, and I just never have. But it's the description and the sort of love of coffee that is mentioned throughout this book. Number one, just always makes me want to have a cup of coffee. And I actually was drinking coffee when I was reading this chapter. But it also reminds me a lot of Twin Peaks and the obsession with coffee in that show.
Yeah.
And how important it kind of figured into the plot as well in a weird way. So it's nice to be able to have like two of my favorite things that center around coffee. But yeah, the description of like the old coffee, like I've had old coffee. I've had like day old coffee at most, and it's otherworldly. Just in a sense of how bad it is. Coffee just has that, it hits that breaking point for me, at least. Like when it drops below a certain temperature, it's undrinkable, and reheating it is no longer an option. So I try to just beat that race every time. But this was, like we just mentioned with the two of them, having opposite views on how lightning might affect them. This was just another wonderful exploration of these two different men and their character and their respect for each other, even in differing with each other when they're, bickering back and forth about something as simple as coffee or tea.
Right. And I am certainly team tea at this point.
I can imagine so, given your job.
Yeah.
I
used to be so into coffee before I started working for a coffee company. I have all this nice brewing equipment at home, and I've got a nice like grinder for coffee and all this. But as soon as I started working for a coffee company, I was like, I can't do this. I can't.
Yeah.
I come home smelling like coffee. I need to change it up. So that's when I started drinking tea and really ended up enjoying it. which we still have tea where I work, but nobody orders it, so
Yep.
it doesn't weigh quite as heavily on my mind.
See, I am solidly a fence sitter here. I love both coffee and tea. I always have loved both. The last bag of coffee I bought was a almost $30 for 12-ounce bag of single origin Yirgacheffe from Ethiopia, and that was incredible. But I'm also the kind of person who really does, much like Colin McLaughlin in Twin Peaks, truly I love a terrible cup of diner coffee.
Diner coffee,
It's
yeah.
delicious.
Diner coffee is so good.
Yeah, I've never had the horrible thing that is, stovetop percolator coffee that's been sitting over a low flame for 5 hours. But I like every cup of coffee I've ever had. So I might be the one person, or the one person who isn't 97 years old who likes that. But I think both tea and coffee have great merits.
I also, sorry, go ahead, Will.
Oh no, you start. You go ahead.
Oh, I also think it's really interesting that, so one of the things that I also have done for the company that I work for is I've become what they call a coffee master, which means I've spent a lot of time learning about the science of coffee and what goes into actually brewing and roasting it and all of that. It required three college courses to complete, in addition to a lot of other learning time. But and so some of the stuff that Dixon brings up in this section about particle diameter and water temperature and all this, it cannot have been that precise back in the 1700s at that point, by any sense of definition.
No, they're having campground coffee. That's totally different.
So reading through that section and seeing him use words that I recognize from very modern methods of coffee brewing and roasting was another part of it that is so funny, because he's using those to describe coffee as much more highfalutin than tea, because it's more than just pouring boiling water onto desiccated leaves.
I did kind of link that with pension living, I think in the Upper East Side in New York City, and him possibly spending time in kind of more bougie and upscale and possibly pretentious coffee places, and having to hear people, call say CTW without explaining what it means and different stuff like that. It reminded me of kind of his general New York vibe that he kind of gains later in his career.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I could see
definitely.
him soaking in those insufferable people in the background talking about that kind of stuff.
I also feel like we could just read out this section. It is we've talked long enough about it. Yeah, I've got it pulled up here. If tasted early, Dixon has found the fine suspended matter in the coffee lends it an undeniable rustic piquance. Later in the pot, the liquid charring itself towards vileness appeals more to those looking for bodily stimuli. Like Dixon, who is able to sip the most degradedly awful pot's end poison and yet beam like an idiot. Best jamoke west of the Alleghenies. A phrase Overseer Barnes mutters often, though neither surveyor quite understands it, especially as the party are yet east of the Alleghenies. Howbeit, at this point in a pot's life cycle, Mason prefers to switch over to tea, when it is Dixon's turn to begin shaking his head. Can't understand how anyone abides that stuff. How so? Mason unable not to react. Which, that inclusion of unable to not react really speaks to, Dixon has clearly noticed that this is something about him that is going to get his goat, so easily, and is specifically bringing it up. Well, it's disgusting, isn't it? Half-rotted leaves, scalded with boiling water, and then left to die, and soak, and bloat. Disgusting. This is tea, friend. Cha. What all tasteful London drinks that, pollicating the coffee pot, is what's disgusting. Au contraire, Dixon replies. Coffee is an art, where precision is all. Water, temperature, mean particle diameter, ratio of coffee to water, or as we say, CTW, and dozens more variables I'd mention. Were they not so clearly out of thy technical grasp? How is it, Mason pretending amiable curiosity. That of each pot of coffee, only the first cup is ever worth drinking, and that by the time I get to it, someone else has already drunk it. Dixon shrugs. You must improve your speed. As to the other, why only the first cup's any good, owing to coffee's sacramental nature, the sacrament being penance, entirely absent from thy sunlit world of hay, whereby the remainder of the pot, often dozens of cups deep, represents the price for enjoying that first perfect cup. Folly, cries Mason. Why, every cup of tea is perfect? For what? Curing hides?
I love that Dixon says, as we say, like he's some kind of coffee sommelier.
Yeah. And I love his purposeful mispronunciation of tea later. He says, with your
Yeah.
tea, as if he's deliberately trying to say it in a much more posh manner.
And furthermore, beyond the jargon being anachronistic, almost certainly.
Yeah.
It's totally possible that especially somebody like Dixon, who is he's not a scientist technically, but he is a scientifically minded person.
Mhm.
He's the kind of guy who would come up with stupid terms and he's the kind of guy who today would absolutely keep a notebook based on how he made his coffee every morning.
Yep. Oh my God, I hadn't even thought of that.
That's fair.
And so, the idea of him having these random terms off the top of his head, okay, whatever. Crazy people are crazy no matter what century. On the other hand, sorry for that siren. It'll be gone in just a second. The nature, the audacity to mention mean particle diameter. Which I don't know if any of you are very aware of grinding mechanics.
Yeah.
We have not had any degree of precision in grinding until the last 100 years, really.
If that even, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the more complicated mechanical things we do very regularly. Coffee grinders are the most expensive part of getting into high-end coffee, except for espresso machines. And it's just the idea that mean particle diameter for him being important must imply that he is taking a mortar and pestle and smashing up the beans and then sifting them out with a screen.
Right. Laying them out to get a good look at them, make sure there's no oversized bits.
Yeah, going through with a tweezer or something.
Yeah.
So really what we've discovered is that Dixon was the first ever coffee snob.
Yeah,
and we have this entire industry to blame for his snobbery.
Well, Kant was a huge fan of coffee as well, and he may have predated him a bit.
Fair. What did we think of the wedge?
So I wanted to kind of preface it by saying that I think Brett mentioned it last week in his email. Last episode in his email. Because I remember asking if the line actually did end up going through anybody's house, and he did mention specifically a Mr. Price's house, and here we get that. The wedge, I felt like this of these 5 chapters, I think this might have been, aside from the coffee and tea debate, might be the most Pinchonian part. Just in that kind of vague ominence that it casts over, everything. There's kind of this weird, unspoken horror hiding in it almost.
Yeah, there is something that feels almost otherworldly in the way they describe the wedge. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's almost a sense of body horror, but applied to geography, interestingly.
Kind of like earlier with the St. Helena and the island as a living being. It has that kind of similar vibe.
Yeah, exactly.
Which we do get a callback to within these chapters. Well,
and I'm very curious. I don't know if Brett would have found anything regarding this. The Iron Hill in the wedge. There were numerous mountains across the original colonies and throughout the modern Midwest that are, have been excavated and found shards. I'm curious as to whether there really was something like that, but full of metal in Delaware.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know that as well.
I do have the mention of the line going through somebody's house from Mason's journal too that I can read.
Oh, yes.
This comes from page 81 of Mason's journal, and I'll start with just the entries that this is a part of. April 5th, began to run the western line in direction of the mean of the 4 marks. April 6th, continued ditto. April 7th, Sunday. April 8th, continued ditto. Crossed White Clay Creek at the distance from the post marked west, 15 miles south of Philadelphia. 1 mile, 58 chains. April 9th, continued ditto. April 10th, continued ditto. Crossed Little Christiana Creek at a distance from ditto, post marked west, 3 miles, 25 chains. At 3 miles, 49 chains, went through Mr. Price's house. April 11th, continued ditto, 4 miles, 9 chains to Great Christiana Creek. And then at a later point in the journal, he mentions Mr. Price's house as a point of reference in distance to somewhere else that they're surveying as well. So there's no further discussion of what happened there, but just the fact that the chains did indeed go through his house.
What did y'all make of the conversation about the chainman's sorrows and the use of instruments that did not belong to their user?
Well, I can see a couple of different ways to think about it. The first one that comes to mind is to refer back to The Crying of Lot 49 with Stanley Kotek's. His big bugbear in that book is more or less the fact that, you know, if you're an engineer working in a modern aerospace firm, you know, you're signing away essentially your inventorship. You're signing it away to be part of this conglomerate. And in some sense, you could view Mason as a very early participant in that sort of system, as a person who works for the Royal Society. He never owns any of his own tools, and so he never grows attached to any of them because they're not his. And you can see how, when you're given power, that might not be destabilizing or discouraging, but at least in the case of Darby and Cope, according to Dixon's mind reading, you know, it eats away at them.
Yeah, true enough. Not to mention that it seems though, even though the tools don't technically belong to Mason, he still is developing an attachment to it. Either that or Dixon thinks he is and is making fun of him for doing so. Mm-hmm. So there still is a inability to escape that idea, even from somebody who has no reason to.
Yeah, and I worked construction for a lot of my high school years. My dad owns a construction company, so I'd work for him in the summer. And I definitely knew people like this that would have tools, even simple things like tape measures or levels, or, you know, real basic things that were very dear to them, and they did not like other people using them, or at least if someone was going to use it, it had to either be under their direct supervision or someone that they really, really trusted. But I knew a carpenter who would, he had extra set of tools that he would give to people when they needed to borrow something that he, you know, that was his, like a particular a saw, or I remember he had a plane, hand plane that he liked to use that he did not want anyone else touching. I learned that the hard way. So I kind of had flashbacks to that when I was reading this section.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I went to not a rural college, but a college that had a lot of, you know, oil field type people. So, you know, open carry of a firearm was pretty common on the campus. So I carried big old pocket knives around, and you know, I would always carry a secondary one because people always ask you for a knife, and then they always go to do something stupid, like use it to drive a screw, or try to like open a package that's, you know, that doesn't need to be cut, but needs to be like levered open or something. So I always carried around a second knife for exactly that purpose. And I know a lot of, you know, in the service industry, a lot of cooks and chefs are the same way about their knives in the kitchen.
So then we meet up with Darby and Cope and their oopsie, as it were, which I think we kind of covered that already pretty well. So we can move on from that. Was there anything else in 48 that anyone wanted to go over?
I did realize that in chapter 46, just real quick, the beginning of that chapter mentions how many German and I think Prussian gun makers are around in that area. And that did it brought up some memories of being taught about the Revolutionary War in school. And one small detail about the Revolutionary War that used to stand out to me, I think possibly because I was very into researching and reading about World War II around that time, is the Americans the Americans in the Revolutionary War did recruit and pay for a lot of mercenaries from Germany and Prussia, which I think that was at least in Europe some of the most expensive and supposedly some of the best mercenaries. And a lot of those mercenaries did end up staying in America, which none of that's clearly stated in that chapter, but that is just kind of the background for that, if anyone was curious. I just wanted to get that out of the way because I was going to bring it up at some point and I forgot to.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I wanted to point out, it's not very important to the book as a whole, but this is probably one of, 2 or 3 uses of the term Dumbledore prior to 1998.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it definitely stands out.
Yeah, because Harry Potter would have been published about a year after this.
All right. Well, in chapter 49, so we have Dixon starting to get paranoid again about their purpose and whether or not they've actually been kind of conscripted to do something that maybe they weren't aware of, and we kind of get a glimpse into his concern that they're not really fully aware of what they're being used for, and whether or not he accuses Masculine of being a French spy. And then it ends on a pretty funny note with the whole sarong, sorry. Exchange there, but I thought that was a really well written passage, and a good glimpse into Dixon's mind and that kind of lingering paranoia that sits with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it, because it's been quite a while since this kind of thing has been brought up directly, it also sort of feels like Pynchon is just sort of trying to remind the reader, like, hey, this is still in the background. This is still what they're thinking about. Keep this in mind as we keep moving forward, because it'll be important later.
Yeah.
That's really the feeling I get out of it.
Well, I think it does a good job of really kind of accurately portraying paranoia, in the sense that you kind of can tend to forget about whatever it is that you're worried about for a good chunk of time, and then it can just suddenly pop back into your head and then really dig itself in there, as it does with Dixon.
Yeah, absolutely. I did also enjoy the appearance of what seems to be a pre-Pony Express formation Pony Express carrier. The person who delivered the book to them.
Yeah. All right, so then we go into Peter Redzinger's Christ Went Away story. I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on that and what you took away from that before we go into the Golems, because I really want to get Luke's thoughts on that. But I thought his Peter's whole story there was really, I feel like there's something to it, and I'm just missing it, or I'm not gathering all the kind of significance of it. I went back and read it, I think, twice. But I wanted to kind of get y'all's opinions on that particular scene.
It's just now occurring to me that could be kind of an example of the kind of deist type thing where God does exist, God created the world, and then he kind of abdicated. It also just kind of vaguely reminded me of in the Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, and the books and the TV show, the whole thing about how earlier in the history of that fictional world, like, magic was a thing, and then possibly because of the rise of civilization and all the trappings of civilization, magic kind of went away. So it seemed to me maybe some kind of commentary on that kind of stuff, like where in the past, and this does kind of lead into the discussion of Kabbalah, and the Golem, in that it is a thing in the Jewish religion, where there's kind of like a descending level of like connection to God, where like I think people like Moses are viewed as kind of like the way that Christians view Jesus, and then the generations following them are, it's kind of like a descending and a lessening connection to the divine as time goes on. Where like, like say there was a Jewish prophet today, well, it would take thousands of years for that person to get anywhere near as important as, say, Moses is to the Jewish religion today, and different Abraham and different people like that. Which is a concept I've come across recently, in terms of like, like a lessening of a connection to the divine over time. It's a little jumbled, I guess, but that's just kind of what it reminds me of.
That makes sense, especially given the later kind of America as a secret body of knowledge thing that comes in towards the end of chapter 50, and previously there's been talk about that kind of change that America went through from being this kind of mystical land of magic, but not really real magic, and into what it is today. So yeah, I think that absolutely tracks.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting religious elements that Pynchon seems to be playing with in these last couple chapters of this section, because I do believe that there is the deistic interpretation of Christ going away as a representative of God creating the universe and then abdicating the throne, so to speak. I do think that you can pull that out of there. I do think that when you get into like the very specific actual wording of how this story is told, there is a lot of it that parallels Christ leaving at the end of the Gospels and at the beginning of Acts before the missionaries go out. In particular, this part, I'm just going to read it, actually. Christ went away, he discovers at last how to tell her. One morning, the eaves adrip, the bleary sun irregularly brighter and dimmer. One day, for no reason that I could see, Christ came to me and said, "Peter, I'm going away. You thought it was hard before this. Here's where it gets impossible. Are you coming back?" I almost couldn't speak. "You must live ever in that expectation. Come, spare me that face. Of course, it is a lot to ask." He seemed in a dangerously merry state. Was it relief at being shut of me at last? How do I proceed without you? What have I been teaching you all this time? I was smit dumb, Louise. I didn't understand the question. Be more like you? I tried. You've been teaching me all this time? And so, like, it's pretty significant that the character is named Peter, even if you have any knowledge of the New Testament, what the significance of that would be. But also this concept of Christ telling Peter that he has to leave, and he doesn't explain why, but he gives him this belief that he needs to expect that he's going to return, and he has to eternally live with that expectation, and that his instructions for how to live with that expectation are what he's been teaching him the entire time. That very Christian reading of the New Testament story applied to a person who's not in the New Testament, so to speak. Like, that is still very much how Christians go about understanding Christ leaving in the early 2nd century, as we understand it. If you're a Christian individual, that's how they understand what they're supposed to do until he gets back, whenever he's going to come back at some random undetermined day. So it seems to be almost doing this dual work of definitely referencing deism, but also having something to do with the overall Christian experience still to this day. And then the fact that his wife then explains that since Christ has left, he's engaging in these kind of magic constructions of these golems. That also seems, to my understanding, to be somewhat of a reference to the idea that when Christ left in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, immediately afterwards, the apostles were given the miraculous gifts of the Spirit, which would certainly seem like magic if they were being done in front of you, albeit it was not, golems necessarily. They were given different, miraculous gifts like tongues and prophecy and healing. But there seems to be somewhat of a deliberate parallel going on there. And I don't know to what extent Pynchon is doing that for, but it is interesting that it's there. And then he has the additional mention of, Jesus ministering to the Indians and the lost tribe of Israel being in America, which seem very, very referential to Mormonism, because that is all within the Book of Mormon as far as what they believe. So he's blending a lot of different Christian elements and Judaistic elements in these last two chapters here, or in the end phase of these 5 chapters. But to what specific end, I'm not 100% sure. But that was what I was continually reminded of as I was reading through it.
I spotted a couple of other rhymes, I guess. That's how I'm going to phrase it. There's I think, I don't like this, but there's probably to be interpreted in this some kind of grand metaphor for Europe finding Christianity, and the modernist realization of God being dead kind of thing. But that's I don't like that at all. But I think it's there. And further, there's also I see it as, and it's in this section somewhere, and I can't find it right now. I've been looking for it the last couple minutes. There is the dropping of the term born again Christianity. And in this instance, we have kind of the most extreme form of what that could possibly be, because people often talk about, oh, I was at my lowest point, and suddenly I felt God with me, and he's been walking with me ever since. And I see this as kind of a Pynchonian sort of jab at that kind of meme, saying, okay, but what if he leaves? Are you going to have the faith that you should have had in the first place? Otherwise, yeah, the deistic view I see a lot, and the Peter connection is pretty important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then we get into the discussion of the golems, and Luke's earlier theory about the duck as a golem is, as Kate mentioned, is validated. So I would love to get some more info and input on this from Luke, since I know you've been this has been like your kind of area of study recently.
Yeah, and just to give the listeners some like names and stuff to look for, there's a YouTube channel called Esoterica that's it's a pretty big YouTube channel. It's run by a rabbi who is an expert on various like occult and mystic, and I think he uses the word arcane to describe the subject material he covers, but he has a long like 15-16 hour class thing on Kabbalah, Kabbalah, and then there's also a playlist devoted to Kabbalah. I actually haven't seen any of his videos on the Golem, but and then in terms of books, the Death is Just Around the Corner guy, Michael S. Judge, recommends Daniel Matt's The Essential Kabbalah, and then the Esoterica guy recommends Daniel Matt's translation of the Zohar. I've also had some experience. I've recently read some stuff by I think it's Gerhard Scholem, I believe is how it's pronounced, who is I think known as the top Kabbalah scholar of I think the 20th century. So that's stuff to look more into if you're interested. Yeah, so the Rabbi of Prague, that proper noun, that's probably, I think, in the Western world, in the non-Jewish world, I think that's probably the most famous instance of there being a golem, is in Prague. I believe in the 16th century, might have been the 15th century. I think it was the 1500s. There was persecution of the Jewish citizens of Prague. I think even the word pogrom it can be used to describe the situation there. And a rabbi in Prague created a golem that defeated the enemies of the Jewish people and protected people of the Jewish faith, which Kate had pointed out a few weeks ago that, you know, like the protective nature of the golem is a central aspect of the golem. So another important thing when thinking about the golem is a lot of times, pretty much I think every instance of golem making that I have read about involves the writing on the forehead of the golem. I want to say it's emeth, and that's what creates the golem, is or what brings it to life. And I actually kind of forget what that means in Hebrew. I'm kind of blanking on that right now. But and then to kill the golem, because golems typically, as we actually see in this section, they grow and grow and grow kind of endlessly unless you kill them, and end their existence. And there is examples from the history of Judaism of kind of like the monkey's paw thing, where you create a golem and then whenever you destroy it, it like falls on you, or different aspects of the person creating the golem dying as a result of them killing the golem. But to kill the golem, you have to erase the E from emeth, and apparently meth in Hebrew means death or dead. So that's what kills the golem. Which doesn't come into play here. This is a bit random, but that whole thing, the Rabbi of Prague and the writing on the forehead, does come into play in a movie that I do really like, which is 10 Cloverfield Lane. There's a part in that movie where the guy talks about getting a tattoo on his forehead that is like a kind of veiled and kind of hard to parse, but definitely their reference to the Rabbi of Prague and the Golem of Prague and the writing on foreheads of golems. The last thing I think I'm going to really get into, there's some stuff I'll probably say after that, but an important aspect of golem making, I believe, is that it's, you know, like Adam, the first man in the Old Testament, was believed to have been originally a golem who was given, given a soul, basically. But creating golems, you're creating life. There is, I think, a varied discussion in different times in Judaism, and different scholars, different rabbis, different mystics have different ideas of whether or not golems have souls or not. But the creation of golems is, I think, viewed as a kind of appropriation of the power of God to give life to things. I think golems can only be created by holy people who are actually holy and faithful, and who faithfully follow the Jewish rules on life and what to eat and what to wear and all of that, which is delineated in the Old Testament, especially in Leviticus. And then I don't know a lot about the concept of the lost tribes of Israel. It's definitely a thing that kind of comes into play a fair amount in pop culture, a fair amount in kind of white guy postmodern literature. I feel like it's referenced a fair amount. Kind of build on some stuff that Kate was just saying a few minutes ago. I did link that to some Mormon beliefs of Jesus coming to North America and blessing the Native Americans with his presence after his crucifixion. And I do kind of wonder where Pynchon got the idea for Native American tribes to being the lost tribes of Israel. It is the kind of thing that I could see like a weird conspiracy website spouting. I could see kind of, a few different possible sources for that. Even just Pynchon coming up with it on his own. So then there's two more things I wanted to talk about. So the part where this new world was ever a secret body of knowledge meant to be studied with the same dedication as the Hebrew Kabbalah would demand. I'm unsure of whether or not a layman in America in the 1700s would know about Kabbalah. I know that at different times in the history of Kabbalah, it's been something only known to a few rabbis and a few scholars, while at other times it's been pretty widespread and pretty kind of central to the Jewish faith. It's kind of gone in and out of popularity and importance. But there is kind of different concepts in Kabbalah where I think there's kind of a legend that you have to be like 40 and have kids and a wife if you want to study the Kabbalah, because you need stuff that like kind of anchors you to reality. There's different aspects of that, of kind of what's more or less in the modern parlance, gatekeeping, about how you need to kind of be a stable person, and different aspects of that where there's requirements for you to be a person who studies who's allowed to study the Kabbalah. There's also there's a mention, I'm having trouble finding it right now, but there's a mention of Jesus being a creator of golems, which I don't think is actually in the New Testament, and I'm not sure where that comes from. I can't think of any instances of Jesus giving life to inanimate objects. I believe that golems are typically made of clay. I don't necessarily remember any aspects of the New Testament where Jesus creates stuff out of clay. The infancy gospel of Thomas is mentioned, which I believe if that exists, which I'm not 100% it does. Sounds like it would be a Gnostic text, and so maybe the Pynchon got that from Gnostic texts, that Jesus somehow made golems. I guess it says Jesus as a boy made small, as you'd say, toy golems out of clay. There has been kind of a fair amount of links between Gnosticism and Jewish mysticism. Kabbalah didn't really start or get developed until I believe the 13th or the 14th centuries in Spain, I believe. So there wouldn't be a large overlap in time between the creation and development of Kabbalah and Gnosticism, because I believe Gnosticism is more of a kind of before the 10th century or before the 11th century as more of a thing. But there is kind of and there are some Kabbalistic texts that do date back that far to the time of Gnosticism. And I have seen some videos and some discussion of the fact that Jewish mysticism and Gnosticism have some overlap, have some kind of synergy in terms of ideas arising in the separate religions at around the same time. The last thing I was going to talk about is I don't know anything about. Like I said, I mean, the golem being so large does seem to speak to the fact that it was created perhaps a while ago, and that it does seem to be a wild golem. It does seem to have kind of escaped the leadership of the Native American tribe that created it. But I don't know anything about golems being invisible while they're moving. That does seem to link it to the duck, though. I do kind of have this weird fan theory about that, the whole thing of like things being invisible because they move so fast, which has nothing to do with Kabbalah. But I personally, in my mind, had this weird link between that and Jurassic Park and the whole thing where like you're not supposed to move and the T-Rex can't see you.
Oh yeah.
Which Jurassic Park would have come out 3 or 4 years before this book was published. Pynchon does have a son who would have been around the age where he might have been into dinosaurs or might have seen that movie. I could weirdly see that whole thing of things being invisible because they're moving so fast being some kind of inside joke between him and his son, or him and someone in his family. I do have some experience with working with children and being around children. And it does strike me as the type of thing that like a 4 to maybe 8 or 10-year-old would think or yell, that they're running so fast that you can't even see them and stuff. But that's neither here nor there in terms of Kabbalah. That's pretty much all I had for that subject. So
I appreciate all that. That's adds a lot of interesting context to that section of the book.
Yeah, just to fill in the bits of information you weren't totally sure on. there is such a thing as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It is a Gnostic work of religious literature. It's been a while since I've read it, but I don't believe there's anything in it about Jesus making golems, but the purpose of that particular Gnostic text is to offer a reading of what Jesus's childhood was like. It's basically a biographical gospel specifically about his childhood. The word that you would put onto a golem's forehead to animate it translates to truth from Hebrew, and then, like you had mentioned, erasing part of it changes it to dead, and that's how you kill it. As far as the origins of Kabbalah and its foundational text, the Zohar, it's pretty difficult to figure out where that came from. The earliest sort of references that we have to it are in secondary sources in the 1500s. It does seem to have first caught on in the Iberian Peninsula in particular, because a pretty famous rabbi from the Iberian Peninsula regularly would cite the Zohar in his criticisms of Maimonides in response to some of Maimonides' writings that were going around at the time. But as far as its actual origin, it's really not clear where it came from or who actually wrote it or from where. Its language is also super strange, not to go down too big of a sidetrack, but the language of the original Zohar text it's so unique that it's actually called Zoharic Aramaic because it's not used anywhere else. And it seems to be a dialect of Aramaic that is deliberately a fusion of the linguistics that were used in the Babylonian Talmud and then the Targum Onkelos. And it has like a very simple, imperfect grammar. And it seems to be potentially medieval in origin, or at least in interpretation, because it has a lot of different loan words from medieval languages contemporaneous to the period in which it was sort of first referenced or discovered. But it was heavily first cited and used by Jews in the Iberian Peninsula.
And to get into the whole the private salute, which is the thing from Star Trek, I believe Leonard Nimoy is Jewish.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that he explains, I think this might be on the Pension Wiki or something, but I think Nimoy explains in like one of his autobiographies that the Springer's finger spread 2 and 2 is a reference to
Shin.
Yeah. So I think that I think that's pretty much taken straight from Nimoy's autobiography.
Yeah, he's mentioned several times that when he came up with that particular gesture, that was what it was based on.
So regarding the invisibility, because I think both of y'all, went above and beyond anything I knew about golems, so thank you for all that. But I'm gonna bring back my my pet theory here and point to Superman.
Okay.
Superman was based on the Golem of Prague, and Superman can turn invisible. And I just see a lot of through lines between the way that the Duck and the Golem are discussed and the way that Superman is framed in the comics.
Again, I believe that Superman was created by Jewish writers and illustrators.
So,
Yeah.
I've read the Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which I don't know if it necessarily gets into Superman specifically, but it does get into the role of Jewish people in the creation of the comic book industry.
Yeah. And I don't know. There's probably I get the sense that there's something to do with the idea of progress being intangible or something that people like to ignore, even if it's right in front of them. And there's this broader concept in all sorts of writers' works of, not necessarily magic being in the real world, but people are ignoring it. But the idea that things are different than they really are if you're not paying close attention. And so I can totally see the way that the Duck and this Golem turn invisible, the way they move, as a sort of weird amalgamation of magic and progress that is just something that we don't allow ourselves to witness.
I do think kind of building off what you're saying, especially with about Superman, is like comics from old comics. And it kind of reminded me of like, Speedy. I think it's Speedy Gonzalez, the Roadrunner. Like, he moves so fast that a lot of times on the page in the comic, when it's on TV, you can't really see him. He's basically like a blur of just kind of like a cloud. There does seem to be kind of a cartoonish aspect, and a comic aspect, both in in a few different meanings, like in two different meanings of the word, to that whole concept.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we know Pynchon loves comics and cartoons. I mean, hell, we get Popeyes in this chapter too. So
yeah,
it's not totally out of the realm of possibility that he would include something like that or have been inspired by something like that. So I wanted to bring up, I've kind of been deliberately staying away from the Reddit, specifically like the comments that were done for the read-alongs in the past. I found myself just kind of going over to him for this set of chapters just to kind of see what people were saying about it. And I stumbled across what I thought was a really interesting kind of summation of one of the overarching themes in the book. And so I just wanted to kind of share it. The user I'm probably horribly mispronouncing. It's either F.A. Halt or Fa-Alt. I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced. Anyways, they make a really good point here. It says, I think there are two major symbols present in the book. The line and the ampersand, contraction of and per se and, representing division and conjunction respectively. The line is connected to surveying, the act of separating land masses, the categorization and rationalization of the Enlightenment, and so on. The ampersand is the opposite force, the expression of the possibility of communication and togetherness across borders, material and immaterial. It is no coincidence that the title is Mason and Dixon and that the ampersand dominates the cover. The symbol in a way defines itself, being a conjunction of the letters E and T, et in Latin meaning and. These two forces, the line and the ampersand, are represented in the relationship of Mason and Dixon, their divisive task and seemingly irreconcilable personalities, and their friendship blossoming in spite of it. So I thought that was, I don't think we've really touched on that aspect of the story of the kind of dual nature of, we're witnessing both the division of the land itself and the joining of these two people, these two main characters and their relationship that forms while they're dividing or creating a line of division across this piece of land.
Yeah, that's a really good insight into those two thematic elements of the book. I have definitely acknowledged them both separately. I didn't consider what they had meant together.
I do wonder, and this is something that I just need to do sometime. If you can sit down and map the plot of the book to the ampersand somehow, topographically,
that would be interesting.
Because there's a sense of looping in certain parts of the book.
Yeah.
Like for example, the Nate McLean's letter in chapter 47 when he's talking about Galactica. At that point the book has shifted away entirely from the parlor room with the family talking about it to essentially we are cutting away from an excerpt of a letter. I don't know. It just seems like there's got to be something there. Although there probably is not really.
You might end up making yourself go crazy trying to figure out if that's a thing or not.
Yeah, the Mobius strips are bad enough in this and Against the Day.
Yeah. Well, then let's move on to our funny parts. For me, I know we've already talked about it. I think it's Mason trying to hide from the lightning, and that whole scene of him cowering under the wagon while Dixon is just kind of sitting back and watching the show, both shows, the lightning and Mason's futile attempts to get away from any kind of potential danger while putting himself in potential danger, was really quite amusing for me.
I think the funniest part for me was in chapter 46, where at least once in every sentence Stig cries "Yinkle Yangle, Yinkle Yangle," denoting something of importance to him. The fact that it's every sentence, not every other sentence, not not every few sentences, but literally every sentence, he's shouting and in a language that presumably no one speaks. He's shouting "Yingle Yangle, Yingle Yangle," which I don't know Swedish. I don't really know Swedish culture at all. I do kind of wonder where that comes from, but it always kind of puts a smile on my face to imagine the Swedish guy walking around with an axe shouting "Yingle Yangle" all the time.
It felt kind of like the Swedish Chef from the Muppets to me.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
And it does have yin and yang in there, which I'm only just now realizing, but I don't necessarily know the connection that we'll have to any discussions of yin and yang perhaps in the future in this book.
See, I think it's really jingle jangle.
Oh yeah, that could be true.
Person.
That could be true.
Yeah, I think we covered all of the funny parts that I would have brought up. The only thing that wasn't in the notes we talked about in the beginning was just the absurdity of the two chainmen not being able to do their job and just choosing random measurements of chain with which to measure all of that out, and then them getting in a fight with one another. Mason and Dixon just watching them beat each other up. That would be probably but everything else I feel like we've covered pretty well. Oh, I guess the complaints that some of the axemen have in their morning meeting, that section is also pretty funny, where they're talking about the particular gripes they have, and it's clear that some of them have been saying the exact same thing every day, and that one guy has a weirdly specific need for his oatmeal more than anything else, and the foreman has clearly just had enough with all of these people.
I forgot about the oatmeal. That was funny.
Yeah, I was considering choosing that whole section just because, whether it is then you must grind your own, lad, or just straightforwardly, just shutting down the joke midway through, even though presumably everyone's heard the joke 1,000 times, this guy keeps telling it. And there are a bunch of other little bits with the overseer, what's his name, that I find very funny, like when he's pretending later on to not understand Mason and Dixon. A lot of it, and this is, I guess, the section I'm going to pick, which is nothing to do with overseer. Is maidens in varying ratios of indignation to curiosity show up in camp, demanding to see Mason or Dixon, or both. Upon meeting the real surveyors, "Well, but you're not him, nor you the other." "Of course not," reply Mason and Dixon. Which it's just a good little joke, because of course they are not him. I am not him, and he is not me.
Well, let's see if anyone can score one of Will's quotes on this episode. Kate, did you want to? I think yours was going to be you mentioned it earlier. Oh, it was Nathaniel's letter, right?
Yeah, I can read that out for sure. "Ahoy, Marie," Nath writes to his school friend back in Tidewater, Virginia. "Was there a sermon about greed? Did I sleep through it? Nothing has prepared me for its power, how unabating. Its fertility, how wild. Occasion for it being presented with every tally mark, bottle astray, honest favor, milkmaid's decur, diversion of tobacco, exchange of specie, every numeral uttered, be it upon paper, or spoken low and allowed to pass with the next breath into the forgotten. They will do me favors I do not need. Strings of iridescent trout, July cherries by the bushel, with the stones already out. Land transaction advice that would put me in a mansion upon Rappahannock with hundreds of slaves and no worries forever, i.e. rewarded as panderers are, in every form but cash, a scarce enough commodity at the coast, becoming, further west at last, only another fabled American substance. What's happening to me, Marie? This sordid haggling out in the open air, axemen sidling by with knowing grins, girls peering apprehensively round corners, popping up from bushes to blow me kisses of encouragement, even Mr. Mason with his eyebrows up into his hat, and Mr. Dixon whistling airs from the Beggar's Opera. I am not the sinister pimp they take me for. Oh, for someone understanding out here in this endless forest. We could ride our winged pigs side by side through the aether and chat about it all. Sweet face, of course, that's it, without a doubt. They talk to me in high, sing-song voices. Either I look younger than I am, or people assume I'm some kind of idiot. This is what books call wheedling. I've heard my first wheedling. Like discovering a new species of bird. 'Tis this curse of being a grown youth, well clapped to life's harness. Yet looking as I did at thee, men don't trust it. More women than I ever imagined find it desirable. I am obliged to behave as unnaturally male toward the one sex, as cherubically neutral toward the other. How is it I nonetheless covet every fair creature who happens day by day to appear in the path of this line, as it speeds its way like a coach upon the coaching road of desire, where we create continually before us the road we must journey upon, the axeman as diligent and unobtrusive as the tailor of Gloucester's mice. Yeah, I think that it's an excellently written section of these chapters, for sure. I mean, there's several lines in here that we talked about at the top of the show when we were talking about this in context of where it laid in these chapters, but you know, the idea of I'm obliged to behave as unnaturally male toward the one sex and as cherubically neutral toward the other. It's another great line. The description of as it speeds its way like a coach upon the coaching road of desire, where we continually create before us the road we must journey upon. You know, there's so many good individual lines in this letter that he's writing, but also in everything that we had talked about. You know, his description of what it's like to suddenly realize that he is a man and not a boy is incredibly well stated. His, you know, realization that he is being placed in a position where he could potentially become rich enough to have a mansion and slaves, him desperately clinging to whether or not there was something in his youth that would have taught him how to navigate this situation, and asking his old friend for whether or not there was a sermon that they listened to on greed, if he could maybe use that to parse out what he's going through, and his just intense confusion at being thrust into a position that he doesn't understand and is worried about where it may take him. Yeah, I think it's an incredibly beautifully written section, and like I had said at the beginning of the show, I could have listened to his thoughts for several more pages.
Yeah, if you hadn't forewarned us that you chose it, you probably would have stolen it from me there.
So I think for me, it's I had initially just kind of taken the end of this particular passage, but I'm going to back up and read more of it, because as I look into it more and more, I kind of think the whole thing is worth reading. So this comes at right after the discussion of the golem. It's on page 47. By the time of Columbus, God's project of disengagement was obvious to all, with the terrible understanding that we were to be left more and more to our own solutions. America, with all for centuries, had been kept hidden, as are certain bodies of knowledge. Only now and then were selected persons allowed glimpses of the new world. Never reporters that anyone else was likely to believe. Men who ate the flesh and fornicated with the ghosts of their dead, murderers and pirates on the run, monks and parchment coracles stitched together from copied pages of the Book of Jonah, fishermen too many nights out of port, any renegade crazed enough to sail west. All matters of what becomes visible and when. Revelation exists as a fact and continues as time proceeds. If new continents may become visible, why not planets, sir, as planets are in your line? You'd have to ask Mason, who should be here hourly. Howbeit, the secret was safe until the choice be made to reveal it. It has been denied to all who came to America for wealth, for refuge, for adventure. This new world was ever a secret body of knowledge, meant to be studied with the same dedication as the Hebrew Kabbalah would demand. Forms of the land, the flow of water, the occurrence of what used to be called miracles are all text, to be attended to, manipulated, read, remembered. Hence, as you may imagine, we take a lively interest in this line of yours, booms the Forge Keeper, inasmuch as it may be read east to west, much as a line of text upon a page of the sacred Torah, a tellure in script, as some might say. 'Twill terminate somewhere to the west, no one, not even you and your partner, knows where, in utterance. A message of uncertain length, apt to be interrupted at any moment, or chain. A smaller pantograph copy down here of occurrences in the higher world. Another case of as above, so below. No longer. Alas, a phrase of power. This age sees a corruption and disabling of the ancient magic. Projectors, brokers of capital, insurancers, peddlers upon the global scale, enterprisers and quacks. These are the last poor fallen and feckless inheritors of a knowledge they can never use, but in the service of greed. The coming rebellion is theirs, Franklin and that lot, and heaven help us, help the rest of us if they prevail. So I was initially just going to do that last paragraph, but I thought the whole thing was really worth reading. I think it's also a really good kind of summation of what Pynchon's been getting at throughout this book, of this whole kind of corruption of what could have been with America into what it has become, you know, largely in part because of the greed and inherent evil of humans, and which, you know, as we've talked about before, was in a weird way seems to have kind of been amplified over here, because the horrors that have taken place here weren't really seen at that time at that level anywhere else in the world, with a few exceptions here and there. But I think, you know, this again comes down to this whole concept of, you know, America had this potential, this ability to be this, you know, as it's called, this hidden body of knowledge that could have been a sort of starting over point and an attempt, or a possibility of kind of expanding and becoming more as a civilization and as a species. But instead we've kind of taken this huge step back as a result of all the corruption and evil that we've brought into it.
Yeah, very true. I've been reminded of, and this is going to seem like a completely random reference, but I've been reminded a lot of the short story The Midnight Meat Train by Clive Barker as we've read through this book. And without spending too much time talking about that story, a big portion of the horror that is revealed in the last, you know, third of it has to do with this idea that there seems to be some indelible quality to the land of America that leads to violence and savagery and a sidestepping of ideals for profit. And obviously some of the horror elements of it suggest as to why that is, but there's a very interesting just bit of social commentary within that storyline that I keep being reminded of as we go through moments like this. And the quote you just read out in your explanation of it is another one of those moments where I'm reminded of it.
So the quote from me, mine's much shorter than y'all's. It was just the opening quote of this section, which is, "When they may, they drink." I know I've talked about my college years a little bit too much already, perhaps, but it just reminds me of being in college. I went to college in a kind of smaller town in Texas. That is not an exciting place. There's not a lot to do. There's actually kind of more to do. It's Abilene, Texas. There's more to do there now. There's more to do there now than there was 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, you know, I felt like I did all the kind of cool, exciting stuff to do there within the first year. And then the rest, it was just smoking weed and drinking. And especially around the time when I turned 21, the phrase "when they may, they drink" would have described me and my friends pretty well. I don't really. I'm more or less sober nowadays, but yeah, it just kind of reminded me of the good old days, as they say.
Yeah, I've been to Abilene several times. My dad used to live there, so I know the smallness you're speaking of.
Yeah, because it's not that small of a place. It's just, it feels like it's a small town.
It feels very small. Yeah, there's really not much to do there. Or I mean, I haven't been there in 20, 25 years, probably, at least.
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit. It's kind of a little more bougie, and there's more like kind of typical kind of hip places now.
Yeah,
but it's
small
still
Texas towns have been doing.
Yeah, yeah, but it's still not a lot to do. Because yeah, my mom and my grandma both live there, and it's just about 3 hours from me. So.
All right. Well, I made it through.
Got to try harder next time.
Seems like it, yeah. Or at the very least, two of you could not very clearly telegraph what you're going to choose. But I'm going with 470. Uh, Yet there remains to the wedge an unseen world, beyond resolution, of transactions never recorded, upon creeksides and beneath hedges, in barns, lofts, and spring houses, in the long summer maize fields, where one may be lost within minutes of entering the vast unforgiving thickets of stalks. Indeed, all manner of secret paths and clearings and alcoves are defined, pushed over or stamped into being, roofless as ruins. For but a few fugitive weeks of lull before autumnal responsibilities come again looming. The sun burns, the gravid, short forests beckon. The soil, when enough is revealed, becomes another sand arena. Anybody may be in there, from clandestine lovers to smugglers of weapons, some hawking contraband, buckles, lockets, tea, laces from France, some marking off lots for use in some future piece of land jobbery. Insect pests are almost intimidated into leaving, but sooner or later come back. I find that truly beautiful, and it is deeply unsettling at the same time.
Yeah. Penchon's very good at that.
Yeah.
That, I think, takes us into our most Penchon part, and that is mine, I think. I had initially put down the coffee and tea debate, but I think after Will reading that particular section on the wedge, I would have to go with that as being the most Penchon part of this section.
Yeah, I actually agree. That was going to be my most Penchon part. And in particular, the quote, resulting from the failure of the tangent point to be exactly at this corner of Maryland, or rather some 5 miles south, creating a semi-cusp or thorn of that length and doubtful ownership, not so much claimed by any one province as prized for its ambiguity, occupied by all those who wish, hardly uncommon in this era of fluid identity, is not to reside anywhere. That sort of zone of ambiguous nature and this idea of fluid identity, and you can occupy it, and all who wish to occupy it do, but they're not residing anywhere. All of that feels very specifically Pinchon in a way that I don't think anything else in these 5 chapters do.
Well, and I realized I meant to bring this up earlier when we were going through the chapters chronologically, but this particular section makes me wonder, do we know if this is going to Delaware? Because if so, is this commentary on the way that Delaware has become the place that corporations establish themselves?
I know that Delaware owns the wedge now.
Yeah, so that's what was coming into my mind the last time I was reading this, was that idea that corporations don't want to reside anywhere. They don't want to be beholden to laws or taxation. The whole point of a company, of a joint stock corporation, is to diffuse the responsibility to nobody in particular.
Yeah, that's true. That's a really good point.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but now that I am thinking about it, it absolutely tracks.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Delaware is a very corporate-friendly place.
Yeah, and this is definitely the part of Delaware I drove through on the way to see the Slaughter Beach, so I can verify that at least at like midnight it is quite spooky in this way.
I think my choice for the most Penchon part is the west of the Alleghenies thing. The best Jamoke west of the Alleghenies. A phrase overseer Barnes utters often. Though neither surveyor quite understands it, especially as the party are yet east of the Alleghenies. I mean, it's obviously a reference to the whole, like the best whatever west of the Mississippi, east of the Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
Which I do think I have heard people unironically say, like it's like the best steak west of the Mississippi, and like actually mean it, So I've definitely heard that said ironically, in maybe not in real life, but I've ironically in movies and TV, but I think I've heard it said unironically in real life. And it's just kind of a little piece of Americana that I don't think people from like a European reader of this book, I don't think would necessarily pick up on that. Is it's just a very thing that's specific to America that Pynchon seems to kind of constantly be throwing that kind of stuff in there, those little pieces of Americana.
I think my most Pynchon part is going to have to be the second letter from Nath to Murray, where he's talking about milkmaids. And I'm not going to read it out, but it is just the way that it is structured, where it starts off with a true excerpt from the letter and immediately jumps away to give us the context of why all of these milkmaids, even though everybody is pining after them, people are like humming this song to themselves that's being transmitted through the like collective unconscious, and they're scamming everybody. You know, they're watering down the milk, they're adding snails, and they're like, I mean, I think we can all kind of presume what the keeping it warm who knows how is referring to. But it's pretty, I mean, these milkmaids are not like good people at all if they're doing all of this. Like these are not like the innocent, you know, mistakes of youth.
So that'll take us into our email from Brett. So we got kind of a long one this time around. He gave us quite a bit of really interesting information. So Kate, if you would go ahead and share that with everyone.
Yeah. Another very cool conversation. Especially enjoyed Kate's comments on rose quartz and deepening relationships. Thanks, Brett. As well as the insights about Lespark's POV in the leptin section. That's really the central question of that episode for me. How much is Lespark's POV coloring the story? I think one could support a range of answers, from some to quite a bit. Also, the conversation about Leptin buying people to have good music at his parties felt especially insightful. Here's some other bullet points in no particular order. I don't have much to add on either Clymer's discourse or Lord Lepton's name. You cover the major resonances of why those two things work very nicely. Auster's appearance. Again, Mason and Dixon don't recognize her right away. I think that's part of the thematic ideas in that section. The discussion you all had about Lespark's comments about Auster being happier was really on point. I think that is coming from Lespark's POV, and we're meant to consider that when thinking about his character. I did a currency conversion on Lespark's 1,000 pounds comment. In 2021 dollars, that's like $160,000 a year. Pretty wide error bars around that, since prices were nowhere near as standardized in the 18th century. It's really hard to get a sense for buying power equivalencies in today's economy. But it's also interesting to note that it took decades after the Revolution for the United States to widely adopt the dollar as official currency. Finally, the historical Mason and Dixon really did draw a line through the House of Rice Price. Pynchon changes the name a little, I think to make a rise price joke about a real estate guy. That detail is noted in the Journal of Mason and Dixon, which you can find here. We'll include a link to that journal in the show notes if there's anybody else who wants to dig into it. With regard to that last one, I think it's a good example of what Pynchon does through the whole book. He'll find one line or idea in the historical record and craft a whole scene out of it. My favorite instance of that, and a top 5 thing I found while working on the companion, happens in the Felipe section. I think I may have recorded this mentioned this in our recorded conversation briefly, but here's my note in full. 431.35. Suriname eel. Suriname, also called Dutch Guyana, was a Dutch colony in the 18th century. There was lots of slaves there. A 1786 issue of the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society has an article by William Bryant titled Account of an Electric Eel, or The Torpedo of Suriname. That's way too close to our story in both time and content to be a coincidence. Might be that this issue of Transactions is lying around our 1786 Philadelphia living room. So, my theory is that Pynchon found this article, imagined it being in the Lespark house, they seem like the kind of people who would read the Transactions, and then had his narrator riff on it. That's really cool on its own, but I also love how that riffing hits on the big themes of the book. Felipe is indeed played up as much more dangerous than torpedoes actually are, but the eel becomes a synecdoche for the line of the whole Enlightenment project. They put him on top of the line. They use him to try and find iron for use in the military-industrial complex. And of course, a torpedo is also a weapon. So, in a comics section, you get a pretty deep commentary on this whole mapping project. They're trying to harness energy, electricity, and power in a way that's compelling and often fun, but also has a dark side, perhaps like one of those Vohm sideshows. And one more note, this one on rose quartz. I think the move from oolite to quartz is also meant to correspond to the theme of reducing possibilities to simplicities. Here's the companion gloss. 440.15. Oolite, quartz. Oolite is a sedimentary rock usually formed in shallow water. It consists of smaller rocks, oids, bonded together. Quartz is harder, more crystalline. Rose quartz, 334.6, is being used as a marker on the line. Here, note that a loose arrangement of particulates, oolite, serves as a valve, a starting point for a harder, more inflexible substance. Quote, reducing possibilities to simplicities, unquote. Again, hope that's helpful. Thank you again, as always, Brett. And thank you for including Mason's journal in your email. I had a really good time reading through all of that. And I pulled some quotes from past things in the book that we've already moved past chronologically. If you guys are down to have me read those out now.
Yeah, absolutely. I am.
That sounds good.
So on 65, page 66, of the journal, we have the following note that I find interesting. January 10th, left Brandywine and proceeded to Lancaster, distance about 35 miles, a town in Pennsylvania, distant from Philadelphia, 75 miles, bearing nearly due west. What brought me here was my curiosity to see the place where was perpetrated last winter the horrid and inhuman murder of 26 Indians, men, women, and children, leaving none alive to tell. These poor, unhappy creatures had always lived under the protection of the Pennsylvania government and had lands allotted for them a few miles from Lancaster by the late celebrated William Penn, Esquire, proprietor. They had received notice of the intention of some of the back inhabitants and fled to the Gaol jail to save themselves. The keeper made the door fast, but it was broken open, and 2 men went in and executed the bloody scene. While about 50 of their party sat on horseback without armed, with guns, etc. Strange it was that the town, though as large as most market towns in England, never offered to oppose them. Though it's more than probable they on request might have been assisted by a company of His Majesty's troops who were then in the town. No honor to them. What was laid to the Indians' charge was that they had held a private correspondence with the enemy Indians, but this could never be proved against the men and women and children, some in their mothers' wombs that never saw light, which could not be guilty. Then at the end of January 10th, it says, wrote a letter from hence to Mr. Kingston. So that's obviously where we get the visiting of different massacre sites earlier in the book from, but it includes, other historical details that apparently people in this town just watched it happen. Like, it wasn't something that a band of people went off and did, and then they heard about it later. Like, townsfolk just watched this massacre take place and just did nothing. And then, moving on to January 17th, just one page later, returning at Pequea, I fell in company with Mr. Samuel Smith, who in the year 1736 was sheriff of Lancaster County, now 3 counties, Lancaster, York, and Cumberland, who informed me that the people near the supposed boundary line were then at open war. About 10 miles from Lancaster on the river Susquehanna, one Mr. Crisp defended his house as being in Maryland with 14 men, which he surrounded with about 55. They would not surrender, but kept firing out till the house was set on fire, and one man in the house lost his life coming out. I include that because I find that to be a patently absurd thing, that this one particular individual believed his house was in a different state, and so he barricaded himself and a bunch of other people inside of this house, and they refused to come out under any justification and just kept firing until it's not clear what set the house on fire, but it reads to me like potentially the sparks from their guns set the house on fire, because they just kept firing over and over and over again, refusing to allow anyone to come near them. It's just a very example of just what seems to be a very Pinchonian thing just happening in real life. And the fact that wasn't included in the book, I find funny, given that it's right after the section where Mason goes and visits the massacre. On the same page 67, it is actually the scene where Mason falls from his horse. On February 24th, it says, Sunday, met some boys just come out of a Quaker meeting house as if the devil had been with them. I could by no means get my horse by them. I gave the horse a light blow on the head with my whip, which brought them to the ground as if shot dead. I over his head, my hat one way, wig another, and whip another. Fine sport for the boys. However, I got up, as did my horse after some time, and I led him to the meeting house, the friends pouring out. Very serene, as if all had been well, but... And then that is the end of note. The next day, the 25th, lay 2, my hip being hurt very much by the fall. So again, another example of like that is a real thing that happened, and obviously Pynchon spins that out into him, seeing his wife and this very like existential spiritual thing, but it's based on something that did occur in reality. Then finally, these last couple of things are mostly just funny notations that I see in there. Mason is really fond of the word dubious. Anytime he wants to describe something going wrong with his calculations, he likes to still put the calculations in there, but then say they're dubious. And it's always that word. He doesn't use a different word for it, but he'll occasionally have lines in there that I find really funny where he'll say, like, these calculations were dubious, owing only in part to loose screws applied to the instrument that needed to be retightened. Like, he sometimes will come up with excuses for why his stuff, it doesn't quite come out the way that he wants it to. But on page, let's see here, on page 74 of his journal, we have on March 30th, ditto, Messrs. Darby and Cope, chain carriers, came from the lower counties, so that we have the arrival of those two buffoons. But then he also will sometimes, just list reasonings why he doesn't work, which I find kind of funny. So on April 1st, April Fool's Day, he just has the word cloudy.
Cloudy, I'm seeing
and nothing else listed. And then proceeds to say ditto, ditto for the next 2 days. And then finally, 3 days later, says, made more observations for finding the direction west. See them in the 6th page following. And then finally, the last one that I had that I just found really funny was after they're about to start working on the west line. So they've finished the tangent line. They get ready to embark on that west line. I also find it very funny on the page just before this, page 91, June 4th, he mentions a man named Enoch Morgan, which is just an absurd name that nobody would have today, but is a good example of what people were being named back then. But on page 92, we have all of his different calculations on where the tangent line ends. And then we get the other mention of Rice Price, the person whose house got bisected on June 7th. Says, note, at the point of intersection of the parallel of latitude and the meridian from the tangent point, we placed a post marked west on the west side and north on the north side. It stands in a meadow belonging to Captain John Singleton, 13 chains, 50 links to the north of the road leading from Newark to the crossroads, and 25 chains, 73 links to the east of Little Christiana Creek. Also, I like how he just includes this almost as if he was excited to reference the ridiculous nature of running a chain through the guy's house. Also, it is 49 chains and 73 links to the east of Mr. Rice Price's house. It is not a measurement he needed to put in there because it's in the opposite direction, but he just includes it at the end. And then I just love that for a period of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, for 8 or 9 days, it just says waiting for commissioners. He's waiting for someone to allow his work to continue. And then finally, several days later, on Monday the 17th, the commissioners of both provinces met at Christiana Bridge in Newcastle County. On the 18th, 7 stones were set as marks for boundaries, viz. 1 on the tangent point, 4 in the periphery of the circle around Newcastle, 1 between the intersection of the periphery with the north line and the intersection of the north line in parallel, and 1 at the intersection of the north line with the parallel of latitude 15 miles south of the southernmost point of the city of Philadelphia. The gentlemen commissioners present received our instructions to continue the parallel latitude in the same manner we have run it to the river Susquehanna, as far as the country is inhabited, etc. And then finally we have him saying that he is preparing to return to the river. So that brings us up to about where we are now in the overall narrative. So those are just some of the interesting notes that I found going through that journal this past week.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go through this because this, I think, just adds such an interesting layer to the book to see what gets pulled specifically and what gets left out.
Absolutely. And it's also interesting just from a historical perspective of getting to see how somebody actually calculated all of this stuff.
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah.
a bunch of it is just his calculations, and then after his calculations, he puts in the journal information for the the past week or past month or whatever. But you get a real sense of just the level of intense, not just math, but just the process. Like, you come away with a lot more of an appreciation for how difficult it was for them to do this, like all the adjustments they have to make, and all of these not just calculations but just descriptions of where stars are and where they are in relation to one another as opposed to last week. And it's incredibly impressive that they were able to do this at all.
Yeah.
Well, so just skimming through it for the first time while you were reading out some of those quotes, a long while ago at this point, I was reading not a lot but a few ship captain's logs, and this reads so similarly to that, or they truly were writing for, in his case, the Royal Society, his bosses, and in like the ship captain's logs case, usually like an insurance company. But the way that you can tell that the default is obscure as much information as possible is kind of hilarious in its own right.
Yeah. Brett, thank you as always. And thank you for sending over that link, because I think that's an invaluable resource to have and to add to our reading of this book. I did want to bring up, I forgot to mention this, a few days ago, somebody on the Reddit had mentioned that they had just started Mason and Dixon on Wednesday, which would have been last week. And I jumped in there and I was like, hey, check out our show. Maybe it'll help with your reading experience. Somebody else commented in there, and I just wanted to just give him a little thanks. So this is from user Tube Reprise, who says, I'm a few weeks ahead of this guy, meaning the poster from last week. And you guys have been a massive help, definitely making the whole experience more enjoyable. So do really appreciate that we're adding some layer of value to anyone who's reading it, and that y'all are enjoying what we're doing, and we're certainly enjoying doing it. So thank you for that. And
yeah, thank you.
Hopefully we can continue to add to that experience for you. So next week is chapters 51 through 55. So we will pick up on that on our next episode, and we thank you all as always for listening. And check us out. We're on Twitter now, and Instagram, and Mastodon. So you can reach us there, leave us a comment, ask us a question. You can also email us at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. But either way, thank you all for listening. We really, really appreciate it, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Luke, real quick. So I finished the first book of the first book of Illuminatus trilogy.
Yeah.
I'm loving it. It's really good. I don't know if Kate or Will, if either of you have read it, but if you haven't, it's really worth checking out.
It's on my list.
It's a fun one. It's been a long time since I've read it, so hearing you guys talk about reading it, I'm excited to potentially revisit that one.
I finished The Eye in the Pyramid, I think, last night. I was kind of powering through it. I do really enjoy it. It's really interesting how it jumps around so much, and yet it doesn't it has this kind of weird kind of logic to it.
Yeah. It feels more at least its tone feels more like Vonnegut than Pynchon, for me at least.
Yeah,
but there's definitely Pynchonian elements in there. I kind of feel like this is if you were to put Vonnegut and Pynchon together, especially early Lot 49 Gravity's Rainbow era Pynchon, with not necessarily early, mid career Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse 5 or Sirens of Titan, that is kind of the vibe I'm getting. But yeah, I'm really, really enjoying it.
Yeah, I might need something more lighthearted after I'm done with the Iliad, because I don't know if I've hated a fictional character more than I hate Hector.
That's fair.
It's been a long time since I read the Iliad, and I wanted to read it because of this new translation. It's the first one done by a woman, and just the level of obscene hatred that I have towards a man who does not exist is really otherworldly.
Yeah. That's a conversation I actually had with my son not too long ago, and my daughter. Actually, we were talking about how it can be okay to like a bad character in a book, not bad like a poorly written, but like an evil antagonist kind of character. Like you can really enjoy hating them viscerally, and it really adds so much to it. So they're both kind of starting to realize that now, which is fun.
That is fun, yeah. And Hector's fine for like the first half, but after the first half of that book ends, man, he becomes just increasingly more insufferable. That just every single time he opens his mouth, I'm like, I can't wait for you to die. Like I know that it's happening, and I know that you're now doubting that it's going to happen. But boy, is it going to be so satisfying once you die. And yeah, if you guys are looking to reread the Iliad, this new translation I think is actually really excellent.
I was going to ask, because it's been a long time since I've read it, and I have a copy of it on my bookshelf. It's one of the, I don't remember which translation it is, but
who's the translation?
The
new one.
Yeah, her name is Carolyn Alexander.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. She wrote a companion book to it that I think I'm probably going to read afterwards, called The War That Killed Achilles, which is about like her process of writing that translation and like the research that went into it, and like why she made certain decisions that she made, and then like the broader historical context of the Iliad and of Achilles as a mythological character. Yeah, all of her decisions that she's made in rendering the translation, I really enjoy. She emphasizes the anti-war aspects of it, for sure, more than a lot of the other translations of it that I've read. And she chooses to render a lot of the actual names of the places or people in what it would have been in the original language. So she doesn't really refer to Troy as Troy. She refers to it as Ilion. And she refers to the different groups of Greeks or Spartans or whatever by the actual terminology of the land that they would have been from. So she chooses to walk a more authentic line in representing what those words would be if you were hearing it back when it was being performed orally. And she does so without losing the lyricality of it, while also not stepping into it being too overwrought or esoteric in its word usage. It's very, very well done.
Did she preserve the dactyls, or is she one of the like switch it to a different mode?
She switches into a different mode. Yeah.
All right. I know enough ancient Greek to start to do a little bit of translation, so I'm very finicky about that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
But I'll have to check it out. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, I really enjoy it. Given that you know that I know like Koine Greek stuff from my days in seminary, but I don't know enough to work on translation. So I'd be curious what your impression of it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not a scholar or anything. Like I've only really read Fagles in full, but I think he's a pretty decent middle ground translator. But I've heard a lot about that one, and I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, I know the Fagles one is considered like a gold standard. That and Lattimore are the two that I hear mentioned all the time.
Yeah, Lattimore's for like the classic folks, and Fagles does a very good job of translating the sensation of Homeric epics. Like his Odyssey really captures the sense of like rushing waves that a lot of the passages in that book kind of create.
Oh, cool.
I just finished a few days ago. What's it called? A Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers.
Oh yeah,
I've been wanting to check that out for a long time. It's just copies of it are a little expensive.
Yeah, it's not easy to find.
What did you think of it?
I was really impressed.
Mhm.
Like, I got halfway through it and I was just I wasn't rolling my eyes, but I was definitely thinking, all right, what is the big deal about this? But it's very good. It's nice and short, and it's not like there's a twist that makes everything change. It's just something about the way that it progresses really grabbed me in the second half.
Yeah, I agree. When they actually go inside the zone, that book really becomes incredibly compelling.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that I found. Oh shoot! What the fuck? Sorry, lost track of what I was gonna say. You go ahead.
I was going to say, if you enjoyed that, I really enjoy the Strugatsky's book. It's Hard to Be a God. That's one of their books that I really enjoy. It's a bit more explicit in its anti-Soviet propaganda, which makes me curious how it got published. But it is a very fascinating conceptual science fiction novel. It's definitely adjacent to something like Roadside Picnic, but it is different in what it's exploring.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to check out some of their other stuff because I've not read a ton of Russian literature, but I've read enough to know that it wasn't the translator that made the prose stand out for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really impressed. One thing that what I was trying to remember earlier was that I saw somebody online mention that it was like one of the most Russian novels they'd ever read. And people say that about literally every Russian book. And my God, it was though. It is incredibly Russian. It's like painfully, depressively, alcoholically Russian.
Yeah, that's kind of everything that the Strugatskys wrote.
Yeah. I'll have to check out their other stuff.
Yeah, they are very quintessentially Russian people. Which, I mean, you really have to be in order to choose to write science fiction during the Iron Curtain era.
Yeah, it's a very self-defeating.
Yeah.
So y'all saw Barbie. I saw Oppenheimer.
I've seen Oppenheimer too.
Oppenheimer.
I wanted to hate it a lot more than I was able to. I liked it a lot.
I've been hearing mixed things on it.
I genuinely think it's probably Christopher Nolan's best film. I don't think it's Christopher Nolan's most interesting film. Like if you're talking about from a conceptual perspective, I think things like Inception or Tenet or those more like very Nolan-esque projects are more interesting conceptually. But from a standpoint of making a cohesive piece of art that has a thesis statement that he completes in the final moments of the film, and in constructing what is a 3-hour movie in a way that does not feel like 3 hours, I thought, I think he did all of that significantly better in this film than anything else that he had made. And he gets a bit more conceptual in some ways that I enjoyed. Like as far as the filmmaking goes, like there's these moments where you get to see kind of what Oppenheimer is imagining in his mind, and the sort of sound and vision imagery that he uses to represent that is very evocative of David Lynch in certain ways. And he even will, like, there's a really excellent scene where Oppenheimer's having to testify about an affair that he had. And then the POV switches to his wife who's sitting on the couch behind him. And then Christopher Nolan frames it as Oppenheimer and this woman that he had an affair with having sex in the chair to actually represent what she's feeling in that moment, hearing this testimony again. So he does some actual like visual storytelling stuff that I think goes further than what he's done in previous films to actually represent what he's getting across the screen to the audience from an emotional perspective or from kind of an internal monologue perspective.
How are the... Oh, go ahead, Will. I'm sorry.
The surreality in so many of his movies is just a waste of time.
Yeah.
And it actually has a purpose in Oppenheimer. It's not just puzzle box bullshit. It is actually like character-driven story development.
Very true.
So that's what I was going to ask about, is the characters, because I think my biggest issue with him as a filmmaker is that his characters are typically pretty one-dimensional for the most part. With a few exceptions. I think Interstellar was like the one film of his where I really cared about the characters more than the plot. I just feel like a lot of times his characters are there to kind of push the plot forward, and they're taking a backseat to actual character development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think he benefits from the fact that Oppenheimer was a very complicated person in real life.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, because his character on screen is not represented one-dimensionally. As far as, and even like the woman that he has an affair with, she's not in the film very, very much, but she's clearly a very complicated person who's going through some stuff mentally. So even some of the lesser characters that don't get a ton of screen time still do have a dimensionality to them that I think is unlike a lot of his other work. Because I agree with you. I mean, the main character of Tenet is called the protagonist. Like, he does not. He's not super interested in presenting characters beyond their ability to move the plot forward.
Yeah, and I think that's been my main thing with him. I like him. I like what Nolan does. I just think typically his films come down to style over substance. Mm-hmm. And that's fine, because sometimes that's really all I want. I love Tenet. I really enjoyed that movie. And even though it was, as we'll put it, puzzle box bullshit at times, it was fun. It just, it was that escapism that I wanted. But when he does good characterization, like I said, Interstellar, like that movie was, I thought, really well done. I thought I actually cared about the characters, and I cared about the journey that they were on, and was moved by the end of it. So,
oh yeah, that scene where Matthew McConaughey has to watch 30 years of messages from his kids.
Yeah, shit.
Like, say all you want about how dumb what's her name's character is in that movie, Anne Hathaway's character. Mm-hmm. Like, she does as good of a job as she can with subpar material. Yeah. But like, I don't. Yeah. So you can say what you want about that not being well presented in the film, but Matthew McConaughey's relationship with his kids, and like that scene being kind of a linchpin of it, and then obviously when his daughter grows up to be an older woman, like all of that is so well represented and in a very realistic, like honest way. I think that was the movie where he wrote it by himself for the first time. Yeah. And so I think that some of that was like shaking the cobwebs out a little bit, because he wasn't writing with his brother anymore, and that's how you end up with an Anne Hathaway character in that movie. But yep. I think that now that he's written 3 movies on his own, Interstellar, Tenet, and then that Oppenheimer, I think that he's finally really figured out how to be his own screenwriter now, which is great. Yeah. Well,
and then the other thing I've been hearing and seeing was the representation of the bomb, and I'm glad you mentioned Lynch earlier, because that's the comparison that keeps getting drawn, is the bomb scene in episode 8 of Twin Peaks Return. Yeah. And how the general consensus is that Lynch did it better with CGI than Nolan did it without, as far as conveying the kind of grand scale of horror and evil that came out of that. So, I was kind of curious what you thought on that.
Yeah, I think that obviously Nolan did see episode 8 of Twin Peaks season 3, like that's for sure. But Nolan is not using the film to talk about the bomb necessarily. The movie is much less about the bomb than I think a lot of people expect going into the theater. Okay. It is significantly more about Oppenheimer himself and his life after the bomb was constructed, and what happened to him after World War II ended. That's significantly more what the movie is about, which is there specifically to play into the thesis statement that Christopher Nolan makes at the beginning of the film, which I won't spoil because it kind of ruins the way that the whole thing goes. So it is significantly of less importance to that movie. So yes, from a standpoint of specifically the bomb itself, like that scene where the Trinity test detonates, yes, Lynch did do it better, but where I see more of the Lynchian elements is in these moments where Oppenheimer is theorizing, like he's thinking about quantum mechanics and theoretical physics, and when that happens, we get other kind of imagery that is supposed to be representative of kind of what he might be imagining in his head, and those are more Lynchian moments. The bomb is more presented just realistically in what they're watching.
Yeah, frankly, like in general, I think of Christopher Nolan as somebody who grew up thinking of Kubrick as the greatest director of all time, and then he got to college and he read like Gravity's Rainbow or something, and just decided, I'm gonna make art that makes people's minds melt, and finally got bored of that.
Yeah.
And it's I mean, like Oppenheimer is just, I mean, it's well done. I could nitpick it to death. I don't feel like doing that, especially since, two of you haven't seen the movie. But like I could complain about it all day.
Yeah.
But it's so much better than the rest of his stuff, and it's because he didn't try to do what I expected. He didn't try to make like the atomic bomb into some puzzle box. He didn't try to make like some realization that Oppenheimer may or may not have had into some grand moment. It really is centering the man as the mystery, using in very much a Pynchonian sense, and I think that's why you get a lot of people on like the subreddit talking about like, oh, it's a lot like Pynchon, is because he is taking this view of trying to flesh out a historical figure from the limited documents we have about him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really want to read the book that his screenplay is based on, because it's based on a biography of Oppenheimer called American Prometheus.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to read that, because I think that may color in more of the history that, as Will just said, we have limited documentation on. But I agree, and I think that not to get on a tangent here that's going to take 15 minutes for me to explain, but my issue with Twin Peaks season 3 is that it felt way too much like David Lynch and not enough Mark Frost. Where Twin Peaks season season 1 is a perfect melding of Mark Frost and David Lynch, where you have this well-established TV director and creator in crime genre and soap opera taking care of like the small town elements, and then you have this very idiosyncratic like artistic filmmaker in David Lynch lending his unique brand of, I'll say, madness to the more supernatural elements of it. And with season 3, it doesn't feel like there's any influence from Mark Frost at all. It just feels like you're watching a David Lynch movie for 7 hours or whatever the runtime is. And to Will's point about Christopher Nolan, like, reading Gravity's Rainbow in college or something, and then deciding that he's going to make art that just melts people's minds. I think that he moved more towards, to kind of undergird Will's point, a mix of Mark Frost and David Lynch with Oppenheimer, where there is individual scenes that are somewhat surrealistic. In fact, there's one scene that I think is very Gravity's Rainbow-esque, whether it's purposeful or not, in which Oppenheimer is kind of visualizing the heat death of the planet, basically due to V2 missiles that are strapped with nuclear warheads, and the way that he kind of envisions this being mapped out as hitting key targets on the planet certainly reminded me of Pointsman's grid from Gravity's Rainbow. Well, I don't know if that's purposeful or not, but it's definitely there. So like you still have these moments of more like mind-melting imagery or interesting imagery or surrealistic imagery, but it's all undergirded by a solid storyline and a solid cast and acting and filmmaking and writing that allows those individual moments of more surrealistic elements to play out in a way that is not present in anything else that Nolan's done.
Yeah, that scene you're talking about, to me it reads, or it views as straight out of the analogous scene in Doctor Strangelove, crossed with some stuff straight out of section 4 of Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah, that's fair.
Well, I can say I didn't detect much Pinchonian elements in Barbie, but it was still really good. You
Oh
should go see
no!
it. It really was. It really exceeded my expectations. In all honesty, like
Mhm.
I figured it was going to be good, but it was better than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad that I watched 0 trailers for that movie.
I think I saw like the first one, and I just kind of stopped watching them after that.
I saw the
'Cause
teaser trailer from months ago where they did the 2001: A Space Odyssey parody, but that's the only thing that I saw. I didn't know anything about how the movie, what it was about, what happened. I didn't watch the like longer trailers or whatever. And yeah, it is very different from what I was expecting, but in a way that is incredibly wonderful. Like it manages to ride a line between genuine emotional depth and just absurd camp. In a way that I can't think of a film in recent history that has done that.
Yeah, it never really. I think going into it, I was afraid it was going to like get too cotton candy-ish, and lose whatever message it was trying to get across. But they never did that. I think they kind of stayed grounded enough the whole time and still, maintained a pretty high level of silliness and camp. But there was still a surprising amount of depth in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't know if I've ever laughed harder than I did when Ken first visits Century City. That whole montage, man, is so absurd.
Oh god, that was good.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's an amazing film.
Yeah. No, I will get around to seeing Oppenheimer. I may end up. I probably won't see it in the theater. So the weird thing is, like, there's San Antonio has one. No, we have two places that can show IMAX, and apparently both of them have been having routine technical problems to where the movie just will not play for whatever weird reason.
Okay.
So I don't have the time to go sit and hope it works and then find out it doesn't and then have to sit and wait for another showing. So
yeah, I would have loved to have had a chance to see it in IMAX because obviously it's the only movie that's ever been shot completely in IMAX film, but there are no IMAX theaters near me where I live in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you do put off seeing it until after theater, even if you don't get out to an IMAX screen, definitely try not to watch it on like streaming, like without manual quality settings.
Oh no, yeah, no. I plan on getting it from the library when it's on Blu-ray, which they're pretty good about getting them close to release date.
It's just one of those movies where I could totally see most of the compression algorithms making complete noise out of many of the best shots of the movie.
Yeah, that's fair. There's also a startling number of actors in Oppenheimer.
Yeah, I heard the cast is pretty big.
Yeah, if Christopher Nolan wanted to, he could have advertised it like Wes Anderson does with his cast list.
Just showing everybody.
Yeah, I genuinely didn't know that most of those people were in that movie.
I don't want to look at a list because I don't want to like spoil any potential.
Yeah, you'll enjoy it when someone else walks in and you're like, oh, you're also in this film? Holy shit.
You know that guy from Mad Men? He's Feynman.